Turquoise Days, Alastair Reynolds. New writer Alastair Reynolds is a frequent contributor to Interzone and has also sold to Asimov Science Fiction, Spectrum SF, and elsewhere. His first novel, Revelation Space, was widely hailed as one of the major SF books of the year. It was followed by a sequel, also attracting much notice, Chasm City. His most recent work is another big new novel, Redemption Arc. His stories have appeared in our 15th, 17th, 18th, and 19th annual collections. A professional scientist with a Ph.D. in astronomy, he comes from Wales, but lives in the Netherlands where he works for the European Space Agency. Here, he takes us on a visit to a serene, peaceful, quiet little planet, a sea world, an idyllic world nearly covered by tropical turquoise oceans. But as we shall see, placid as things seem, you never know what's lurking beneath the surface, or when it's going to come out to get you. 1. Naki Oakpeak waited until her sister was safely asleep before she stepped onto the railed balcony that circled the gondola. It was the most perfectly warm and still summer night in months. Even the breeze caused by the airship's motion was warmer than usual, as soft against her cheek as the breath of an attentive lover. Above, yet hidden by the black curve of the vacuum bladder, the two moons were nearly at their fullest. Microscopic creatures sparkled 100 meters under the airship, great schools of them daubing galaxies against the profound black of the sea. Spirals, flukes, and arms of luminescence wheeled and coiled as if in thrall to secret music. Naki looked to the rear, where the airship's ceramic-jacketed sensor pod carved a twinkling furrow. Pinks and rubies and furious greens sparkled in the wake. Occasionally they darted from point to point with the nervous motion of kingfishers. As ever, she was alert to anything unusual in movements of the messenger sprites, anything that might merit a note in the latest circular, or even a full-blown article in one of the major journals of juggler studies. But there was nothing odd happening tonight, no yet-to-be-catalogued forms or behavior patterns, nothing that might indicate more significant pattern juggler activity. She walked around the airship's balcony until she had reached the stern, where the submersible sensor pod was tethered by a long fiber-optic dragline. Naki pulled a long, hinged stick from her pocket, flicked it open in the manner of a courtesan's fan, and then waved it close to the winch assembly. The default watercolored lilies and sea serpents melted away, replaced by tables of numbers, sinuous graphs, and trembling histograms. A glance established that there was nothing surprising here either, but the data would still form a useful calibration set for other experiments. As she closed the fan, delicately, for it was worth almost as much as the airship itself, Naki reminded herself that it was a day since she had gathered the last batch of incoming messages. Rot had taken out the connection between the antenna and the gondola during the last expedition, and since then collecting the messages had become a chore, to be taken in turns or traded for less tedious tasks. Naki gripped a handrail and swung out behind the airship. Here the vacuum bladder overhung the gondola by only a meter, and a grilled ladder allowed her to climb around the overhang and scramble onto the flat top of the bag. She moved gingerly, bare feet against rusting rungs, doing her best not to disturb Mina. The airship rocked and creaked a little as she found her balance on the top, and then was again silent and still. The churning of its motors was so quiet that Naki had long ago filtered the sound from her experience. All was calm, beautifully so. In the moonlight, the antenna was a single dark flower rising from the broad back of the bladder. Naki started moving along the railed catwalk that led to it, steadying herself as she went, but feeling much less vertigo than would have been the case in daytime. Then she froze, certain that she was being watched. Just within Naki's peripheral vision appeared a messenger sprite. It had flown to the height of the airship and was now shadowing it from a distance of 10 or 12 meters. Naki gasped, delighted and unnerved at the same time. Apart from dead specimens, this was the first time Naki had ever seen a sprite this close. The organism had the approximate size and morphology of a terrestrial hummingbird, yet it glowed like a lantern. Naki recognized it immediately as a long-range packet carrier. Its belly would be stuffed with data coded into tightly packed wads of RNA, locked within microscopic protein capsomeres. The packet carrier's head was a smooth teardrop, patterned with luminous pastel markings, but lacking any other detail save for two black eyes positioned above the midline. Inside the head was a cluster of neurons, which encoded the positions of the brightest circumpolar stars. Other than that, sprites had only the most rudimentary kind of intelligence. They existed only to shift information between nodal points in the ocean when the usual chemical signaling pathways were deemed too slow or imprecise. The sprite would die when it reached its destination, consumed by microscopic organisms that would unravel and process the information stored in the capsomeres. And yet Naki had the acute sense that it was watching her. Not just the airship, but her, with a kind of watchful curiosity that made the hairs on the back of her neck bristle. And then, just at the point when the feeling of scrutiny had become unsettling, the sprite whipped sharply away from the airship. Naki watched it descend back toward the ocean and then coast above the surface, bobbing now and then like a skipping stone. She remained still for several more minutes, convinced that something of significance had happened, and yet also aware of how subjective the experience had been, how unimpressive it would seem if she tried to explain it to Mina tomorrow. Anyway, Mina was the one with the special bond to the ocean, wasn't she? Mina was the one who scratched her arms at night. Mina was the one who had too high a conformal index to be allowed into the swimmer corps. It was always Mina. It was never Naki. The antenna's meter-wide dish was anchored to a squat plinth inset with weatherproofed controls and readouts. It was century-old Pelican technology, like the airship and the fan. Many of the controls and displays were dead, but the unit was still able to lock on to the functioning satellites. Naki flicked open the fan and copied the latest feeds into the fan's remaining memory. Then she knelt down next to the plinth, propped the fan on her knees, and sifted through the messages and news summaries of the last day. A handful of reports had arrived from friends in Prachuap Pangnirtung and Umingmaktok snowflake cities, another from an old boyfriend in the swimmer corps station on Naratiwat Atoll. He had sent her a list of jokes that were already in wide circulation. She scrolled down the list, grimacing more than grinning, before finally managing a half-hearted chuckle at one that had escaped her. Then there were a dozen digests from various special interest groups related to the jugglers, along with a request from a journal editor that she critique a paper. Naki skimmed the paper's abstract, judging that she was probably capable of reviewing it. She scrolled through the remaining messages. There was a note from Dr. Sivaraksa saying that her formal application to work on the Moat project had been received and was now under consideration. There had been no official interview, but Naki had met Sivaraksa a few weeks earlier when the two of them happened to be in Umingmaktok. Sivaraksa had been in an encouraging mood during the meeting, though Naki couldn't say whether that was due to her having given a good impression or the fact that Sivaraksa had just had his tapeworm swapped for a nice new one. But Sivaraksa's message said she could expect to hear the result in a day or two. Idly, Naki wondered how she would break the news to Mina if she was offered the job. Mina was critical of the whole idea of the moat and would probably take a dim view of her sister having anything to do with it. Scrolling down farther, she read another message from a scientist in Kaanak, requesting access to some calibration data she had obtained earlier in the summer. Then there were 4 or 5 automatic weather advisories, drafts of 2 papers she was contributing to, and an invitation to attend the amicable divorce of Kugluktuk and Gjoa, scheduled to take place in 3 weeks' time. Following that, there was a summary of the latest worldwide news, an unusually bulky file, and then there was nothing. No further messages had arrived for 8 hours. There was nothing particularly unusual about that. The ailing network was always going down. But for the second time that night, the back of Naki's neck tingled. Something must have happened, she thought. She opened the news summary and started reading. 5 minutes later, she was waking Mina. "I don't think I want to believe it," Mina Oakpeak said. Naki scanned the heavens, dredging childhood knowledge of the stars. With some minor adjustment to allow for parallax, the old constellations were still more or less valid when seen from Turquoise. "That's it, I think." "What?" Mina said, still sleepy. Naki waved her hand at a vague area of the sky, pinned between Scorpius and Hercules. "Ophiuchus. If our eyes were sensitive enough, we'd be able to see it now, a little prick of blue light." "I've had enough of little pricks for one lifetime," Mina said, tucking her arms around her knees. Her hair was the same pure black as Naki's, but trimmed into a severe spiked crop, which made her look younger or older depending on the light. She wore black shorts and a shirt that left her arms bare. Luminous tattoos in emerald and indigo spiraled around the piebald marks of random fungal invasion that covered her arms, thighs, neck, and cheeks. The fullness of the moons caused the fungal patterns to glow a little themselves, shimmering with the same emerald and indigo hues. Naki had no tattoos and scarcely any fungal patterns of her own, and could not help feeling slightly envious of her sister's adornments. Mina continued, "But seriously, you don't think it might be a mistake?" "I don't think so, no. See what it says there? They detected it weeks ago, but they kept quiet until now so that they could make more measurements." "I'm surprised there wasn't a rumor." Naki nodded. "They kept the lid on it pretty well, which doesn't mean there isn't going to be a lot of trouble." And they think this blackout is going to help?" "My guess is official traffic's still getting through. They just don't want the rest of us clogging up the network with endless speculation." "Can't blame us for that, can we? I mean, everyone's going to be guessing, aren't they?" "Maybe they'll announce themselves before very long," Naki said doubtfully. While they had been speaking, the airship had passed into a zone of the sea largely devoid of bioluminescent surface life. Such zones were almost as common as the nodal regions where the network was thickest, like the gaping voids between clusters of galaxies. The wake of the sensor pod was almost impossible to pick out, and the darkness around them was absolute, only occasionally relieved by the mindless errand of a solitary messenger sprite. Mina said, "And if they don't?" "Then I guess we're all in a lot more trouble than we'd like." For the first time in a century, a ship was approaching Turquoise, commencing its deceleration from interstellar cruise speed. The flare of the light hugger's exhaust was pointed straight at the Turquoise system. Measurement of the Doppler shift of the flame showed that the vessel was still 2 years out, but that was hardly any time at all on Turquoise. The ship had yet to announce itself, but even if it turned out to have nothing but benign intentions, a short trade stopover perhaps, the effect on Turquoise society would be incalculable. Everyone knew of the troubles that followed the arrival of the Pelican in impiety. When the Ultras moved into orbit, there had been much unrest below. Spies had undermined lucrative trade deals. Cities had jockeyed for prestige, competing for technological tidbits. There had been hasty marriages and equally hasty separations. A century later, old enmities smoldered just beneath the surface of cordial intercity politics. It wouldn't be any better next time. "Look," Mina said, "it doesn't have to be all that bad. They might not even want to talk to us. Didn't a ship pass through the system about 70 years ago without so much as a by your leave?" Naki nodded. It was mentioned in a sidebar to one of the main articles. They had engine trouble or something, but the experts say there's no sign of anything like that this time. "So they've come to trade. What have we got to offer them that we didn't have last time?" "Not much, I suppose." Mina nodded knowingly. "A few works of art that probably won't travel very well. 10-hour-long nose flute symphonies, anyone?" She pulled her face. "That's supposedly my culture, and even I can't stand it. What else? A handful of discoveries about the jugglers, which have more than likely been replicated elsewhere a dozen times. Technology? Medicine? Forget it. They must think we have something worth coming here for, Naki said. Whatever it is, we'll just have to wait and see, won't we? It's only 2 years. I expect you think that's quite a long time, Mina said. Actually. Mina froze. Look! Something whipped past in the night, far below, then a handful of them, then a dozen, and then a whole bright squadron. Messenger sprites, Naki diagnosed. But she had never seen so many of them moving at once, and on what was so evidently the same errand. Against the darkness of the ocean, the lights were mesmerizing, curling and weaving, swapping positions and occasionally veering far from the main pack before arcing back toward the swarm. Again, one of the sprites climbed to the altitude of the airship, loitering for a few moments on fanning wings before whipping off to rejoin the others. The swarm receded, becoming a tight ball of fireflies and then only a pale globular smudge. Naki watched until she was certain that the last sprite had vanished into the night. "Wow," Mina said quietly. "Have you ever seen anything like that?" "Never." "Bit funny that it should happen tonight, wouldn't you say?" "Don't be silly," Mina said. "The jugglers can't possibly know about the ship." "We don't know that for sure. Most people heard about this ship hours ago. That's more than enough time for someone to have swum." Mina conceded her younger sister's point with a delicate provisional nod of the head. "Still, information flow isn't usually that clear-cut. The jugglers store patterns, but they seldom show any sign of comprehending actual content. We're dealing with a mindless biological archiving system, a museum without a curator." "That's one view." Mina shrugged. "I'd love to be proved otherwise." "Well, do you think we should try following them? I know we can't track sprites over any distance, but we might be able to keep up for a few hours before we drain the batteries." "We wouldn't learn much." "We wouldn't know until we tried," Naki said, gritting her teeth. "Come on, it's got to be worth a go, hasn't it? I reckon that swarm moved a bit slower than a single sprite. We'd at least have enough for a report, wouldn't we?" Mina shook her head. "All we'd have is a single observation with a little bit of speculation thrown in. You know we can't publish that sort of thing. And anyway, assuming that sprite swarm did have something to do with the ship, there are going to be hundreds of similar sightings tonight." "I was just hoping it might take our minds off the news." "Perhaps it would, but it would also make us unforgivably late for our target." Mina dropped the tone of her voice, making an obvious effort to sound reasonable. "Look, I understand your curiosity. I feel it as well. But the chances are it was either a statistical fluke or part of a global event everyone else will have had a much better chance to study. Either way, we can't contribute anything useful, so we might as well just forget about it." She rubbed at the marks on her forearm, tracing the paisley-patterned barbs and whorls of glowing coloration. "And I'm tired, and we have several busy days ahead of us. I think we just need to put this one down to experience, all right?" "Fine," Naki said. "I'm sorry, but I just know we'd be wasting our time." "I said fine." Naki stood up and steadied herself on the railing that traversed the length of the airship's back. "Where are you going?" "To sleep. Like you said, we've got a busy day coming up. We'd be fools to waste time chasing a fluke, wouldn't we?" An hour after dawn, they crossed out of the dead zone. The sea below began to thicken with floating life, becoming soupy and torpid. A kilometer or so farther in, and the soup showed ominous signs of structure, a blue-green stew of ropey strands and wide kelp-like plates. They suggested the floating, half-digested entrails of embattled sea monsters. Within another kilometer, the floating life had become a dense vegetative raft, stinking of brine and rotting cabbage. Within another kilometer of that, the raft had thickened to the point where the underlying sea was only intermittently visible. The air above the raft was humid, hot and pungent with microscopic irritants. The raft itself was possessed of a curiously beguiling motion, bobbing and writhing and gyring according to the ebb and flow of weirdly localized current systems. It was as if many invisible spoons stirred a great bowl of spinach. Even the shadow of the airship, pushed far ahead of it by the low sun, had some influence on the movement of the material. The pattern juggler biomass scurried and squirmed to evade the track of the shadow, and the peculiar purposefulness of the motion reminded Naki of an octopus she had seen in the Terrestrial Habitats Aquarium on Umingmaktok, squeezing its way through impossibly small gaps in the glass prison of its tank. Presently they arrived at the precise center of the circular raft. It spread away from them in all directions, hemmed by a distant ribbon of sparkling sea. It felt as if the airship had come to rest above an island, as fixed and ancient as any geological feature. The island even had a sort of geography, humps and ridges and depressions sculpted into the cloying texture of layered biomass. But there were few islands on Turquoise, especially at this latitude, and the juggler node was only a few days old. Satellites had detected its growth a week earlier, and Mina and Naki had been sent to investigate. They were under strict instructions simply to hover above the island and deploy a handful of tethered sensors. If the node showed any signs of being unusual, a more experienced team would be sent out from Umingmaktok by high-speed dirigible. Most nodes dispersed within 20 to 30 days, so there was always a sense of urgency. They might even send trained swimmers, eager to dive into the sea and open their minds to alien communion, ready to, as they said, ken the ocean. But first things first. Chances were this node would turn out to be interesting rather than exceptional. "Morning," Mina said when Naki approached her. Mina was swabbing the sensor pod she had reeled in earlier, collecting green mucus that had adhered to its ceramic teardrop. All human artifacts eventually succumbed to biological attack from the ocean, although ceramics were the most resilient. "You're cheerful," Naki said, trying to make the statement sound matter-of-fact rather than judgmental. "Aren't you? It's not everyone gets a chance to study a node up this close. Make the most of it, sis. The news we got last night doesn't change what we have to do today." Naki scraped the back of her hand across her nose. Now that the airship was above the node, she was breathing vast numbers of aerial organisms into her lungs with each breath. The smell was redolent of ammonia and decomposing vegetation. It required an intense effort of will not to keep rubbing her eyes more raw than was already the case. "Do you see anything unusual?" "Bit early to say." "So that's a no, then." "You can't learn much without probes, Naki." Mina dipped a swab into a collection bag, squeezing tight the plastic seal. Then she dropped the bag into a bucket between her feet. "Oh, wait. I saw another of those swarms after you'd gone to sleep." "I thought you were the one complaining about being tired." Mina dug out a fresh swab and rubbed vigorously at a deep olive smear on the side of the sensor. "I picked up my messages, that's all. Tried again this morning, but the blackout still hadn't been lifted. I picked up a few shortwave radio signals from the closest cities, but they were just transmitting a recorded message from the Snowflake Council. Stay tuned and don't panic." "So let's hope we don't find anything significant here," Naki said, "because we won't be able to report it if we do." "They're bound to lift the blackout soon. In the meantime, I think we have enough measurements to keep us busy. Did you find that spiral sweep program in the airship's avionics box?" "I haven't looked for it," Naki said, certain that Mina had never mentioned such a thing before. "But I'm sure I can program something from scratch in a few minutes." "Well, let's not waste any more time than necessary. Here." Smiling, she offered Naki the swab, its tip laden with green slime. "You take over this, and I'll go and dig out the program." Naki took the swab after a moment's delay. "Of course. Prioritize tasks according to ability, right?" "That's not what I meant," Mina said soothingly. "Look, let's not argue, shall we? We were best friends until last night. I just thought it would be quicker." She trailed off and shrugged. "You know what I mean. I know you blame me for not letting us follow the sprites, but we had no choice but to come here. Understand that, will you? Under any other circumstances— "I understand," Naki said, realizing as she did how sullen and childlike she sounded, how much she was playing the petulant younger sister. The worst of it was that she knew Mina was right. At dawn it all seemed much clearer. "Do you, really?" Naki nodded, feeling the perverse euphoria that came with an admission of defeat. "Yes, really. We'd have been wrong to chase them." Mina sighed. "I was tempted, you know. I just didn't want you to see how tempted I was, or else you'd have found a way to convince me." "I'm that persuasive?" "Don't underestimate yourself, sis. I know I never would." Mina paused and took back the swab. "I'll finish this. Can you handle the sweep program?" Naki smiled. She felt better now. The tension between them would still take a little while to lift, but at least things were easier now. Mina was right about something else. They were best friends, not just sisters. "I'll handle it," Naki said. Naki stepped through the hermetic curtain into the air-conditioned cool of the gondola. She closed the door, rubbed her eyes, and then sat down at the navigator's station. The airship had flown itself automatically from Umingmaktok, adjusting its course to take cunning advantage of jet streams and weather fronts. Now it was in hovering mode. Once or twice a minute the electrically driven motors purred, stabilizing the craft against gusts of wind generated by the microclimate above the juggler node. Naki called up the current avionics program, a menu of options appearing on a flat screen. The options quivered. Naki thumped the screen with the back of her hand until the display behaved itself. Then she scrolled down through the other flight sequences, but there was no pre-programmed spiral loaded into the current avionics suite. Naki rummaged around in the background files, but there was nothing to help her there either. She was about to start hacking something together. At a push, it would take her half an hour to assemble a routine, when she remembered that she had once backed up some earlier avionics files onto the fan. She had no idea if they were still there, or even if there was anything useful among the cache, but it was probably worth taking the time to find out. The fan lay closed on a bench, where Mina must have left it after she verified that the blackout was still in force. Naki grabbed the fan and spread it open across her lap. To her surprise, it was still active. Instead of the usual watercolor patterns, the display showed the messages she had been scrolling through earlier. She looked closer and frowned. These were not her messages at all. She was looking at the messages Mina had copied onto the fan during the night. At this realization, Naki felt an immediate prickle of guilt. She knew that she should snap the fan shut, or at the very least close her sister's mail and delve into her own area of the fan. But she did neither of those things. Telling herself that it was only what anyone else would have done, she accessed the final message in the list and examined its incoming timestamp. To within a few minutes it had arrived at the same time as the final message Naki had received. Mina had been telling the truth when she said that the blackout was continuing. Naki glanced up. Through the window of the gondola she could see the back of her sister's head, bobbing up and down as she checked winches along the side. Naki looked at the body of the message. It was nothing remarkable, just an automated circular from one of the juggler special interest groups, something about neurotransmitter chemistry. She exited the circular, getting back to the list of incoming messages. She told herself that she had done nothing shameful so far. If she closed Mina's mail now, she would have nothing to feel guilty about. But a name she recognized jumped out at her from the list of messages, Dr. Jota Sivaraksa, manager of the Moat Project. The man she had met in Umingmaktok, glowing with renewed vitality after his yearly worm change. What could Mina possibly want with Sivaraksa? She opened the message, read it. It was exactly as she had feared, and yet not dared to believe. Sivaraksa was responding to Mina's request to work on the moat. The tone of the message was conversational, in stark contrast to the business-like response Naki had received. Sivaraksa informed her sister that her request had been appraised favorably, and that while there were still one or two other candidates to be considered, the expectation was that Mina would emerge as the most convincing applicant. Even if this turned out not to be the case, Sivaraksa continued, and that outcome was not thought very likely, Mina's name would be at the top of the list when further vacancies became available. In short, she was more or less guaranteed a chance to work on the moat within the year. Naki read the message again, just in case there was some highly subtle detail that threw the entire thing into a different, more benign light. Then she snapped shut the fan with a sense of profound fury. She placed it back where it was, exactly as it had been. Mina pushed her head through the hermetic curtain. "How's it coming along?" "Fine," Naki said. Her voice sounded drained of emotion even to herself. "Got that routine cobbled together?" "Coming along," Naki said. "Something the matter?" "No." Naki forced a smile. "No, just working through the details. Have it ready in a few minutes." "Good. Can't wait to start the sweep. We're going to get some beautiful data, sis. And I think this is going to be a significant node, maybe the largest this season. Aren't you glad it came our way?" "Thrilled," Naki said, before returning to her work. 30 specialized probes hung on telemetric cables from the underside of the gondola, dangling like the venom-tipped stingers of some grotesque aerial jellyfish. The probes sniffed the air meters above the jugular biomass, or skimmed the fuzzy green surface of the formation. Weighted plumb lines penetrated to the sea beneath the raft, sipping the organism-infested depths dozens of meters under the node. Radar mapped larger structures embedded within the node, dense kernels of compacted biomass, or huge cavities and tubes of implacable function, while sonar graphed the topology of the many sinewy organic cables which plunged into darkness, umbilicals anchoring the node to the seabed. Smaller nodes drew most of their energy from sunlight and the breakdown of sugars and fats in the sea's other floating microorganisms, but the larger formations, which had a vastly higher information processing burden, needed to tap belching aquatic fissures, active rifts in the ocean bed kilometers under the waves. Cold water was pumped down each umbilical by peristaltic compression waves, heated by being circulated in the superheated thermal environment of the underwater volcanoes, and then pumped back to the surface. In all this sensing activity, remarkably little physical harm was done to the extended organism itself. The biomass sensed the approach of the probes and rearranged itself so that they passed through with little obstruction, even those scything lines that reached into the water. Energy was obviously being consumed to avoid the organism sustaining damage, and by implication the measurements must therefore have had some effect on the node's information processing efficiency. The effect was likely to be small, however, and since the node was already subject to constant changes in its architecture, some probably intentional and some probably forced on it by other factors in its environment, there appeared to be little point in worrying about the harm caused by the human investigators. Ultimately, so much was still guesswork. Although the swimmer teams had learned a great deal about the pattern jugglers' encoded information, almost everything else about them, how and why they stored the neural patterns, and to what extent the patterns were subject to subsequent post-processing, remained unknown. And those were merely the immediate questions. Beyond that were the real mysteries which everyone wanted to solve, but were simply beyond the scope of immediate academic study. What they would learn today could not be expected to shed any light on those profundities. A single data point, even a single clutch of measurements, could not usually prove or disprove anything. But nonetheless, it might later turn out to play a vital role in some chain of argument, even if it was only in the biasing of some statistical distribution closer to one hypothesis than another. Science, as Naki had long since realized, was as much a swarming social process as it was something driven by ecstatic moments of personal discovery. It was something she was proud to be part of. The spiral sweep continued uneventfully, the airship chugging around in a gently widening circle. Morning shifted to early afternoon, and then the sun began to climb down toward the horizon, bleeding pale orange into the sky through soft-edged cracks in the cloud cover. For hours, Naki and Mina studied the incoming results, the ever-sharper scans of the node appearing on screens throughout the gondola. They discussed the results cordially enough, but Naki could not stop thinking about Mina's betrayal. She took a spiteful pleasure in testing the extent to which her sister would lie, deliberately forcing the conversation around to Dr. Sivaraksa and the project he steered. "I hope I don't end up like one of those deadwood bureaucrats," Naki said when they were discussing the way their careers might evolve. "You know, like Sivaraksa." She observed Mina pointedly, yet giving nothing away. "I read some of his old papers. He used to be pretty good once, but now look at him." "It's easy to say that," Mina said, "but I bet he doesn't like being away from the front line any more than we would. But someone has to manage these big projects. Wouldn't you rather it was someone who'd at least been a scientist?" "You sound like you're defending him. Next you'll be telling me you think the moat is a good idea." "I'm not defending Sivaraksa," Mina said. "I'm just saying—" She eyed her sister with a sudden glimmer of suspicion. Had she guessed that Naki knew? "Never mind. Sivaraksa can fight his own battles. We've got work to do." "Anyone would think you were changing the subject," Naki said. But Mina was already on her way out of the gondola to check the equipment again. At dusk, the airship arrived at the perimeter of the node, completed one orbit, then began to track inward again. As it passed over the parts of the node previously mapped, time-dependent changes were highlighted on the displays. Arcs and bands of red superimposed against the lime and turquoise false color of the mapped structures. Most of the alterations were minor, a chamber opening here or closing there, or a small alteration in the network topology to ease a bottleneck between the lumpy subnodes dotted around the floating island. Other changes were more mysterious in function, but conformed to types seen in other studies. They were studied at enhanced resolution, the data prioritized and logged. It looked as if the node was large, but in no way unusual. Then night came, as swiftly as it always did at those latitudes. Mina and Naki took turns sleeping for 2 or 3 hour stretches, while the other kept an eye on the readouts. During a lull, Naki climbed up onto the top of the airship and tried the antenna again, and for a moment was gladdened when she saw that a new message had arrived. But the message itself turned out to be a statement from the Snowflake Council stating that the blackout on civilian messages would continue for at least another 2 days, until the current crisis was over. There were allusions to civil disturbances in 2 cities, with curfews being imposed, and imperatives to ignore all unofficial news sources concerning the nature of the approaching ship. Naki wasn't surprised that there was trouble, though the extent of it took her aback. Her instincts were to believe the government line. The problem, from the government's point of view, was that nothing was known for certain about the nature of the ship, and so by being truthful they ended up sounding like they were keeping something back. They would have been far better off making up a plausible lie, which could be gently molded toward accuracy as time passed. Mina rose after midnight to begin her shift. Naki went to sleep and dreamed fitfully, seeing in her mind's eye red smears and bars hovering against amorphous green. She had been staring at the readouts too intently for too many hours. Mina woke her excitedly before dawn. "Now I'm the one with the news," she said. "What?" "Come and see for yourself." Naki rose from her hammock, neither rested nor enthusiastic. In the dim light of the cabin, Mina's fungal patterns shone with peculiar intensity, abstract, detached shapes that only implied her presence. Naki followed the shapes onto the balcony. "What?" she said again, not even bothering to make it sound like a question. "There's been a development," Mina said. Naki rubbed the sleep from her eyes. "With the node?" "Look, down below, right under us." Naki pressed her stomach hard against the railing and leaned over as far as she dared. She had felt no real vertigo until they had lowered the sensor lines, and then suddenly there had been a physical connection between the airship and the ground. But was it her imagination, or had the airship lowered itself to about half its previous altitude, reeling in the lines at the same time? The midnight light was all spectral shades of milky gray. The creased and crumpled landscape of the node reached away into mid-gray gloom, merging with the slate of the overlying cloud deck. Naki saw nothing remarkable, other than the surprising closeness of the surface. "I mean really look down," Mina said. Naki pushed herself against the railing more than she had dared before, until she was standing on the very tips of her toes. Only then did she see it. Directly below them was a peculiar circle of darkness, almost as if the airship was casting a distinct shadow beneath itself. It was a circular zone of exposed seawater, like a lagoon enclosed by the greater mass of the node. Steep banks of jugular biomass, its heart a deep charcoal gray, rimmed the lagoon. Naki studied it quietly, sensing that her sister might judge her on any remark she made. "How did you see it?" she asked eventually. "See it? It can't be more than 20 meters wide. A dot like that would have hardly shown up on the topographic map." "Naki, you don't understand. I didn't steer us over the hole. It appeared below us as we were moving. Listen to the motors. We're still moving. The hole's shadowing us. It follows us precisely." "Must be reacting to the sensors," Naki said. "I've hauled them in. We're not trailing anything within 30 meters of the surface. The node's reacting to us, Naki, to the presence of the airship. The jugglers know we're here, and they're sending us a signal." "Maybe they are, but it isn't our job to interpret that signal. We're just here to take measurements, not to interact with the jugglers." "So whose job is it?" Mina asked. "Do I have to spell it out? Specialists from Umingmaktok. They won't get here in time. You know how long nodes last. By the time the blackout's lifted, by the time the swimmer corps hotshots get here, we'll be sitting over a green smudge and not much more. This is a significant find, Naki. It's the largest node this season, and it's making a deliberate and clear attempt to invite swimmers." She stepped back from the railing. "Don't even think about it." "I've been thinking about it all night. This isn't just a large node, Naki. Something's happening. That's why there's been so much sprite activity. If we don't swim here, we might miss something unique. And if we do swim, we'll be violating every rule in the book. We're not trained, Mina. Even if we learned something, even if the jugglers deigned to communicate with us, we'd be ostracized from the entire scientific community." "That would depend on what we learned, wouldn't it?" "Don't do this, Mina. It isn't worth it." "We won't know if it's worth it or not until we try, will we?" Mina extended a hand. "Look, you're right in one sense. Chances are pretty good nothing will happen. Normally you have to offer them a gift, a puzzle or something rich in information. We haven't got anything like that. What'll probably happen is we hit the water and there won't be any kind of biochemical interaction. In which case it doesn't matter. We don't have to tell anyone. And if we do learn something but it isn't significant, well, we don't have to tell anyone about that either. Only if we learn something major, something so big that they'll have to forget about a minor violation of protocol." "A minor violation?" Naki began, almost laughing at Mina's audacity. "The point is, sis, we have a win-win situation here, and it's been handed to us on a plate. You could also argue that we've been handed a major chance to fuck up spectacularly." "You read it whichever way you like. I know what I see." "It's too dangerous, Mina. People have died." Naki looked at Mina's fungal patterns, enhanced and emphasized by her tattoos. "You flagged high for conformality. Doesn't that worry you slightly?" "Conformality's just a fairy tale they use to scare children into behaving," said Mina. "Eat all your greens or the sea will swallow you up forever. I take it about as seriously as I take the Thule Kraken or the drowning of Arviat. I'm fully aware of the risk. The Thule Kraken is a joke, and Arviat never existed in the first place. But the last time I checked, conformality was an accepted phenomenon." "It's an accepted research topic. There's a distinction." "Don't split hairs," Naki began. Mina gave every indication of not having heard Naki speak. Her voice was distant, as if she were speaking to herself. It had a lilting, sing-song quality. Too late to even think about it now. But it isn't long until dawn. I think it'll still be there at dawn. She pushed past Naki. Where are you going now? To catch some sleep. I need to be fresh for this. So will you. They hit the lagoon with 2 gentle, anticlimactic splashes. Naki was underwater for a moment before she bobbed to the surface, holding her breath. At first, she had to make a conscious effort to start breathing again. The air immediately above the water was so saturated with microscopic organisms that choking seemed a real possibility. Mina, surfacing next to her, drew in gulps with wild enthusiasm, as if willing the tiny creatures to invade her lungs. She shrieked delight at the sudden cold. When they had both gained equilibrium, treading with their shoulders above water, Naki was finally able to take stock. She saw everything through a stinging haze of tears. The gondola hovered above them, poised beneath the larger mass of the vacuum bladder. The life raft that it had deployed was sparkling new, rated for 100 hours against moderate biological attack. But that was for mid-ocean, where the density of jugular organisms would be much less than in the middle of a major node. Here, the hull might only endure a few tens of hours before it was consumed. Once again, Naki wondered if she should withdraw. There was still time. No real damage had yet been done. She could be back in the boat and back aboard the airship in a minute or so. Mina might not follow her, but she did not have to be complicit in her sister's actions. But Naki knew she would not be able to turn back. She could not show weakness now that she had come this far. Nothing's happening, she said. We've only been in the water a minute, Mina said. The 2 of them wore black wetsuits. The suits themselves could become buoyant if necessary. All it would take would be the right sequence of tactile commands, and dozens of tiny bladders would inflate around the chest and shoulder area. But it was easy enough to tread water. In any case, if the jugglers initiated contact, the suits would probably be eaten away in minutes. The swimmers who had made repeated contact often swam naked or near naked, but Naki was not prepared for that level of abject surrender to the ocean's assault. Nor was Mina. After another minute, the water no longer seemed as cold. Through gaps in the cloud cover, the sun was harsh on Naki's cheek. It etched furiously bright lines in the bottle-green surface of the lagoon, lines that coiled and shifted into fleeting calligraphic shapes as if conveying secret messages. The calm water lapped gently against their upper bodies. The walls of the lagoon were meter-high masses of fuzzy vegetation, like the steep banks of a river. Now and then, Naki felt something brush gently against her feet, like a passing frond or strand of seaweed. The first few times she flinched at the contact, but after a while it became strangely soothing. Occasionally something stroked one or other hand, then moved playfully away. When she lifted her hands from the sea, mats of gossamer green draped from her fingers like the tattered remains of expensive gloves. The green material slithered free and slipped back into the sea. It tickled between her fingers. Nothing still happened, Naki said, more quietly this time. You're wrong. The shoreline's moved closer. Naki looked at it. It's a trick of perspective. I assure you it isn't. Naki looked back at the raft. They had drifted 5 or 6 meters from it. It might as well have been a kilometer for all the sense of security that the raft now offered. Mina was right. The lagoon was closing in on them, gently, slowly. If the lagoon had been 20 meters wide when they had entered, it must now be a third smaller. There was still time to escape before the hazy green walls squeezed in on them, but only if they moved now, back to the raft, back into the safety of the gondola. Mina, I want to go. We're not ready for this. We don't need to be ready. It's going to happen. We're not trained. Call it learning on the job in that case. Mina was still trying to sound outrageously calm, but it wasn't working. Naki heard the flaw in her voice. She was either terribly frightened or terribly excited. You're more scared than I am, she said. I am scared, said Mina. Scared we'll screw this up. Scared we'll blow this opportunity. Understand? I'm that kind of scared. Either Naki was treading water less calmly, or the water itself had become visibly more agitated in the last few moments. The green walls were perhaps 10 meters apart, and now were not quite the sheer vertical structures they had appeared before. They had taken on form and design, growing and complexifying by the second. It was akin to watching a distant city emerge from fog, the revealing of bewildering, plunging layers of mesmeric detail, more than the eye or the mind could process. "It doesn't look as if they're expecting a gift this time," Mina said. Veined tubes and pipes coiled and writhed around each other in constant, sinuous motion, making Naki think of some hugely magnified circuitry formed from plant parts. It was restless, living circuitry that never quite settled into one configuration. Now and then checkerboard designs appeared, or intricately interlocking runes. Sharply geometric patterns flickered from point to point, echoed, amplified, and subtly iterated at each move. Distinct three-dimensional shapes assumed brief solidity, carved from greenery as if by the deft hand of a topiarist. Naki glimpsed unsettling anatomies, the warped memories of alien bodies that had once entered the ocean 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000 years ago. Here a three-jointed limb, here the shield-like curve of an exoskeletal plaque. The head of something that was almost equine melted into a goggling mass of faceted eyes. Fleetingly, a human form danced from the chaos, but only once. Alien swimmers outnumbered human swimmers vastly. Here were the pattern jugglers Naki knew. The first explorers had mistaken these remembered forms for indications of actual sentience, thinking that the oceanic mass was a kind of community of intelligences. It was an easy mistake to have made, but it was some way from the truth. These animate shapes were enticements, like the gaudy covers of books. The minds themselves were captured only as frozen traces. The only living intelligence within the ocean lay in its own curatorial system. To believe anything else was heresy. The dance of bodies became too rapid to follow. Pastel-colored lights glowed from deep within the green structure, flickering and stuttering. Naki thought of lanterns burning from the depths of a forest. Now the edge of the lagoon had become irregular, extending peninsulas toward the center of the dwindling circle of water, while narrow bays and inlets fissured back into the larger mass of the node. The peninsulas sprouted grasping tendrils, thigh-thick at the trunk, but narrowing to the dimensions of plant fronds, and then narrowing further, bifurcating into lacy, fern-like hazes of awesome complexity. They diffracted light like the wings of dragonflies. They were closing over the lagoon, forming a shimmering canopy. Now and then a sprite, or something smaller but equally bright, arced from one bank of the lagoon to another. Brighter things moved through the water like questing fish. Microscopic organisms were detaching from the larger fronds and tendrils, swarming in purposeful clouds. They batted against her skin, against her eyelids. Every breath that she took made her cough. The taste of the pattern jugglers was sour and medicinal. They were in her, invading her body. She panicked. It was as if a tiny switch had flipped in her mind. Suddenly all other concerns melted away. She had to get out of the lagoon immediately, no matter what Mina would think of her. Thrashing more than swimming, Naki tried to push herself toward the raft. But as soon as the panic reaction had kicked in, she had felt something else slide over her. It was not so much paralysis as an immense sense of inertia. Moving, even breathing, became problematic. The boat was impossibly distant. She was no longer capable of treading water. She felt heavy, and when she looked down, she saw that a green haze enveloped the parts of her body that she could see above water. The organisms were adhering to the fabric of her wetsuit. "Mina!" she called. "Mina!" But Mina only looked at her. Naki sensed that her sister was experiencing the same sort of paralysis. Mina's movements had become languid, and yet instead of panic, what Naki saw in her face was profound resignation and acceptance. It was dangerously close to serenity. Mina wasn't frightened at all. The patterns on her neck were flaring vividly. Her eyes were closed. Already the organisms had begun to attack the fabric of her suit, stripping it away from her flesh. Naki could feel the same thing happening to her own suit. There was no pain, for the organism stopped short of attacking her skin. With a mighty effort, she hoisted her forearm from the water, studying the juxtaposition of pale flesh and dissolving black fabric. Her fingers were as stiff as iron. But, and Naki clung to this, the ocean recognized the sanctity of organisms, or at least thinking organisms. Strange things might happen to people who swam with the jugglers, things that might be difficult to distinguish from death or near death. But people always emerged afterward, changed perhaps, but essentially whole. No matter what happened now, they would survive. The jugglers always returned those who swam with them, and even when they did effect changes, they were seldom permanent. Except, of course, for those who didn't return. No, Naki told herself. What they were doing was foolish, and might perhaps destroy their careers. But they would survive. Mina had flagged high on the conformality index when she had applied to join the swimmer corps. But that didn't mean she was necessarily at risk. Conformality merely implied a rare connection with the ocean. It verged on the glamorous. Now Mina was going under. She had stopped moving entirely. Her eyes were blankly ecstatic. Naki wanted to resist that same impulse to submission, but the strength had flown away from her. She felt herself commence the same descent. The water closed over her mouth, then her eyes, and in a moment she was under. She felt herself a toppled statue sliding toward the seabed. Her fear reached a crescendo and then passed. She was not drowning. The froth of green organisms had forced itself down her throat, down her nasal passage. She felt no fright. There was nothing except a profound feeling that this was what she had been born to do. Naki knew what was happening, what was going to happen. She had studied enough reports on swimmer missions. The tiny organisms were infiltrating her entire body, creeping into her lungs and bloodstream. They were keeping her alive, while at the same time flooding her with chemical bliss. Droves of the same tiny creatures were seeking routes to her brain, inching along the optic nerve, the oral nerve, or crossing the blood-brain barrier itself. They were laying tiny threads behind them, fibers that extended back into the larger mass of organisms suspended in the water around her. In turn, these organisms established data-carrying channels back into the primary mass of the node, and the node itself was connected to other nodes, both chemically and via the packet-carrying sprites. The green threads bound Naki to the entire ocean. It might take hours for a signal to reach her mind from halfway around Turquoise, but it didn't matter. She was beginning to think on juggler time, her own thought processes seeming pointlessly quick, like the motion of bees. She sensed herself becoming vaster. She was no longer just a pale, hard-edged thing labeled Naki, suspended in the lagoon like a dying starfish. Her sense of self was rushing out toward the horizon in all directions, encompassing first the node and then the empty oceanic waters around it. She couldn't say precisely how this information was reaching her. It wasn't through visual imagery, but more an intensely detailed spatial awareness. It was as if spatial awareness had suddenly become her most vital sense. She supposed this was what swimmers meant when they spoke of kenning. She kenned the presence of other nodes over the horizon, their chemical signals flooding her mind, each unique, each bewilderingly rich in information. It was like hearing the roar of 100 crowds. And at the same time, she kenned the ocean depths, the cold fathoms of water beneath the node, the life-giving warmth of the crustal vents. Closer, too, she kenned Mina. There were two neighboring galaxies in a sea of strangeness. Mina's own thoughts were bleeding into the sea, into Naki's mind, and in them Naki felt the reflected echo of her own thoughts, picked up by Mina. It was glorious. For a moment their minds orbited each other, kenning each other on a level of intimacy neither had dreamed possible. "Mina, can you feel me?" "I'm here, Naki. Isn't this wonderful?" The fear was gone utterly. In its place was a marvelous feeling of imminence. They had made the right decision, Naki knew. She had been right to follow Mina. Mina was deliciously happy, basking in the same hopeful sense of security and promise. And then they began to sense other minds. Nothing had changed, but it was suddenly clear that the roaring signals from the other nodes were composed of countless individual voices, countless individual streams of chemical information. Each stream was the recording of a mind that had entered the ocean at some point. The oldest minds, those that had entered the ocean in the deep past, were the faintest ones, but they were also the most numerous. They had begun to sound alike, the shapes of their stored personalities blurring into each other, no matter how alien they had been to start with. The minds that had been captured more recently were sharper and more variegated, like oddly shaped pebbles on a beach. Naki kenned brutal alienness, baroque architectures of mind shaped by outlandish chains of evolutionary contingency. The only thing any of them had in common was that they had all reached a certain threshold of tool-using intelligence, and had all, for one reason or another, been driven into interstellar space where they had encountered the pattern jugglers. But that was like saying the minds of sharks and leopards were alike because they had both evolved to hunt. The differences between the minds were so cosmically vast that Naki felt her own mental processes struggling to accommodate them. Even that was becoming easier. Subtly, slowly enough that from moment to moment she was not aware of it, the organisms in her skull were returning her neural connections, and allowing more and more of her consciousness to seep out into the extended processing loom of the sea. She sensed the most recent arrivals. They were all human minds, each a glittering gem of distinctness. Naki sensed a great gulf in time between the earliest human mind and the last recognizably alien one. She had no idea if it was 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000 years, but it felt immense. At the same time, she grasped that the ocean had been desperate for newness, and that while these human minds were welcome, they were barely sufficient. The minds were snapshots, frozen in the conception of a single thought. It was like an orchestra of instruments, all sustaining a single unique note. Perhaps there was a grindingly slow evolution in those minds. She sensed the merest subliminal hint of change. But if that was the case, it would take centuries to complete a thought, thousands of years to complete the simplest internalized statement. The newest minds might not even have come to the realization that they had been swallowed by the sea. Yet now Naki sensed a single mind flaring louder than the others. It was recent and human, and yet there was something about it that struck her as discordant. The mind was damaged, as if it had been captured imperfectly. It was disfigured, giving off squalls of hurt. It had suffered dreadfully. It was reaching out to her, craving love and affection, something to cling to in the abyssal loneliness it now knew. Images ghosted through her mind. Something was burning. Flames licked through the interstitial gaps in a great black structure. She couldn't tell if it was a building or a vast pyramidal bonfire. She heard screams and then something hysterical, which she at first took for more screaming until she realized that it was something far, far worse. It was laughter, and as the flames roared higher, consuming the mass, smothering the screams, the laughter only intensified. She thought it might be the laughter of a child. Perhaps it was her imagination, but this mind appeared more fluid than the others. Its thoughts were still slow, far slower than Naki's, but the mind appeared to have usurped more than its share of processing resources. It was stealing computational cycles from neighboring minds, freezing them into absolute stasis while it completed a single sluggish thought. The mind worried Naki. Pain and fury was boiling off it. Mina kenned it too. Naki tasted Mina's thoughts and knew that her sister was equally disturbed by the mind's presence. Then she felt the mind's attention shift, drawn to the two inquisitive minds that had just entered the sea. It became aware of both of them, quietly watchful. A moment or two passed, and then the mind slipped away, back to wherever it had come from. What was that? She felt her sister's reply. I don't know. A human mind. A conformal, I think. Someone who was swallowed by the sea. but it's gone now. No, it hasn't. It's still there, just hiding. Millions of minds have entered the sea, Naki. Thousands of conformals, perhaps, if you think of all the aliens that came before us. There are bound to be one or two bad apples. That wasn't just a bad apple. It was like touching ice, and it sensed us. It reacted to us. Didn't it? She sensed Mina's hesitation. We can't be sure. Our own perceptions of events aren't necessarily reliable. I can't even be certain we're having this conversation. I might be talking to myself. Mina, don't talk like that. I don't feel safe. Me neither, but I'm not going to let one frightening thing unnecessarily affect me. Something happened then. It was a loosening, a feeling that the ocean's grip on Naki had just relented to a significant degree. Mina and the roaring background of other minds fell away to something much more distant. It was as if Naki had just stepped out of a babbling party into a quiet, adjacent room, and it was even now moving farther and farther away from the door. Her body tingled. She no longer felt the same deadening paralysis. Pearl-gray light flickered above. Without being sure whether she was doing it herself, she moved toward the surface. She was aware that she was moving away from Mina, but for now all that mattered was to escape the sea. She wanted to be as far from the mind as possible. Her head rammed through a crust of green into air. At the same moment, the jugular organisms fled her body in a convulsive rush. She thrashed stiff limbs and took in deep, panicked breaths. The transition was horrible, but it was over in a few seconds. She looked around, expecting to see the sheer walls of the lagoon, but all she saw in one direction was open waters. Naki felt panic rising again. Then she kicked herself around and saw a wavy line of bottle green that had to be the perimeter of the node, perhaps half a kilometer away from her present position. The airship was a distant silvery teardrop that appeared to be perched on the surface of the node itself. In her fear, she did not immediately think of Mina. All she wanted to do was reach the safety of the airship, to be aloft. Then she saw the raft, bobbing only 100 or 200 meters away. Somehow it had been transplanted to the open waters as well. It looked distant but reachable. She started swimming, the fear giving her strength and sense of purpose. In truth, she was still thick, well within the true boundary of the node. The water was still thick with suspended microorganisms, so it was more like swimming through cold green soup. It made each stroke harder, but by the same token she did not have to expend much effort to stay afloat. Did she trust the pattern jugglers not to harm her? Perhaps. After all, she had not encountered their minds at all, if they even had minds. They were merely the archiving system. Blaming them for that one poisoned mind was like blaming a library for one hateful book. But it had still unnerved her profoundly. She wondered why none of the other swimmers had ever communicated their encounters with the mind. After all, she remembered it well enough now, and she was nearly out of the ocean. She might forget shortly. There were bound to be subsequent neurological effects, but under other circumstances there would have been nothing to prevent her relating her experiences to a witness or inviolable recording system. She kept swimming and began to wonder why Mina hadn't emerged from the waters as well. Mina had been just as terrified, but Mina had also been more curious and more willing to ignore her fears. Naki had grasped the opportunity to leave the ocean when the jugglers released their grip on her. But what if Mina had elected to remain? What if Mina was still down there, still in communion with the jugglers? Naki reached the raft and hauled herself aboard, being careful not to capsize it. She saw that the raft was still largely intact. It had been moved, but not damaged, and although the ceramic sheathing was showing signs of attack, peppered here and there with scabbed green accretions, it was certainly good for another few hours. The rot-hardened control systems were still alive, and still in telemetric connection with the distant airship. Naki had crawled from the sea naked. Now she felt cold and vulnerable. She pulled an aluminized quilt from the raft's supply box and wrapped it around herself. It did not stop her from shivering, did not make her feel any less nauseous, but at least it afforded some measure of symbolic barrier against the sea. She looked around again, but there was still no sign of Mina. Naki folded aside the weatherproof control cover and tapped commands into the matrix of waterproofed keys. She waited for the response from the airship. The moment stretched, but there it was, a minute shift in the dull gleam on the silver back of the vacuum bladder. The airship was turning, pivoting like a great slow weather vane. It was moving, responding to the raft's homing command. But where was Mina? Now something moved in the water next to her, coiling in weak, enervated spasms. Naki looked at it with horrified recognition. She reached over, still shivering, and with appalled gentleness fished the writhing thing from the sea. It lay in her fingers like a baby sea serpent. It was white and segmented, half a meter long. She knew exactly what it was. It was Mina's worm. It meant Mina had died. 2. 2 years later, Naki watched a spark fall from the heavens. Along with many hundreds of spectators, she was standing on the railed edge of one of Umingmaktok's elegant cantilevered arms. It was afternoon. Every visible surface of the city had been scoured of rot and given a fresh coat of crimson or emerald paint. Amber bunting had been hung along the metal stay lines that supported the tapering arms protruding from the city's towering commercial core. Most of the berthing slots around the perimeter were occupied with passenger or cargo craft, while many smaller vessels were holding station in the immediate airspace around Umingmaktok. The effect, which Naki had seen on her approach to the city a day earlier, had been to turn the snowflake into a glittering, delicately ornamented vision. By night they had fireworks displays. By day, as now, conjurers and confidence tricksters wound their way through the crowds. Nose flute musicians and drum dancers performed impromptu atop improvised podia. Kickboxers were cheered on as they moved from one informal ring to another, pursued by whistle-blowing proctors. Hastily erected booths were marked with red and yellow pennants, selling refreshments, souvenirs, or tattoo work, while pretty costumed girls who wore backpacks equipped with tall flagstaffs sold drinks or ices. The children had balloons and rattles marked with the emblems of both Umingmaktok and the Snowflake Council, and many of them had had their faces painted to resemble stylized space travelers. Puppet theaters had been set up here and there, running through exactly the same small repertoire of stories that Naki remembered from her childhood. The children were enthralled nonetheless, mouths agape at each miniature epic, whether it was a roughly accurate account of the world's settlement, with the colony ship being stripped to the bone for every gram of metal it held, or something altogether more fantastic, like the drowning of Arviat. It didn't matter to the children that the one was based in fact and the other pure mythology. To them, the idea that every city they called home had been cannibalized from the belly of a 4-kilometer-long ship was no more or less plausible than the idea that the living sea might occasionally snatch cities beneath the waves when they displeased it. At that age, everything was both magical and mundane, and she supposed that the children were no more or less excited by the prospect of the coming visitors than they were by the promised fireworks display or the possibility of further treats if they were well behaved. Other than the children, there were animals, caged monkeys and birds, and the occasional expensive pet being shown off for the day. One or two servitors stalked through the crowd, and occasionally a golden float cam would bob through the air, loitering over a scene of interest like a single detached eyeball. Turquoise had not seen this level of celebration since the last acrimonious divorce, and the networks were milking it remorselessly, overanalyzing the tiniest scrap of information. This was, in truth, exactly the kind of thing Naki would normally have gone to the other side of the planet to avoid. But something had drawn her this time, and made her wangle the trip out from the moat at an otherwise critical time in the project. She could only suppose that it was a need to close a particular chapter in her life, one that had begun the night before Mina's death. The detection of the ultra ship, they now knew that it was named the Voice of Evening, had been the event that triggered the blackout, and the blackout had been Mina's justification for the two of them attempting to swim with the jugglers. Indirectly, therefore, the Ultras were responsible for whatever had happened to Mina. That was unfair, of course, but Naki nonetheless felt the need to be here now, if only to witness the visitors' emergence with her own eyes, and see if they really were the monsters of her imagination. She had come to Umingmaktok with a stoic determination that she would not be swept up by the hysteria of the celebrations. Yet now that she had made the trip, now that she was amidst the crowd, drunk on the chemical buzz of human excitement, with a nice fresh worm hooked onto her gut wall, she found herself in the perverse position of actually enjoying the atmosphere. And now everyone had noticed the falling spark. The crowd turned their heads into the sky, ignoring the musicians, conjurers, and confidence tricksters. The backpacked girls stopped and looked aloft along with the others, shielding their eyes against the midday glare. The spark was the shuttle of the Voice of Evening, now parked in orbit around Turquoise. Everyone had seen Captain Moreau's ship by now, either with their own eyes as a moving star, or via the images captured by the orbiting cameras or ground-based telescopes. The ship was dark and sleek, outrageously elegant. Now and then its conjoiner drives flickered on just enough to trim its orbit, those flashes like brief, teasing windows into daylight for the hemisphere below. A ship like that could do awful things to a world, and everyone knew it. But if Captain Moreau and his crew meant ill of Turquoise, they'd had ample opportunity to do harm already. They had been silent at 2 years out, but at 1 year out, the Voice of Evening had transmitted the usual approach signals, requesting permission to stop over for 3 or 4 months. It was a formality, no one argued with Ultras, but it was also a gladdening sign that they intended to play by the rules. Over the next year, there had been a steady stream of communications between the ship and the Snowflake Council. The official word was that the messages had been designed to establish a framework for negotiation and person-to-person trade. The Ultras would need to update their linguistics software to avoid being confused by the subtleties of the Turquoise dialects, which, although based on Canadian, contained confusing elements of Inuit and Thai, relics of the peculiar social mix of the original settlement coalition. The falling shuttle had slowed to merely supersonic speed now, shedding its plume of ionized air. Dropping speed with each loop, it executed a lazily contracting spiral above Umingmaktok. Naki had rented cheap binoculars from one of the vendors. The lenses were scuffed, shimmering with the pink of fungal bloom. She visually locked onto the shuttle, its roughly delta shape wobbling in and out of sharpness. Only when it was 2,000 or 3,000 meters above Umingmaktok could she see it clearly. It was very elegant, a pure, brilliant white, like something carved from cloud. Beneath the manta-like hull, complex machines, fans, and control surface moved too rapidly to be seen as anything other than blurs of subliminal motion. She watched as the ship reduced speed until it hovered at the same altitude as the Snowflake City. Above the roar of the crowd, an ecstatic, flag-waving mass, all Naki heard was a shrill hum, almost too far into ultrasound to detect. The ship approached slowly. It had been given instructions for docking with the arm adjacent to the one where Naki and the other spectators gathered. Now that it was close, it was apparent that the shuttle was larger than any of the dirigible craft normally moored to the city's arms. By Naki's estimate, it was at least half as wide as the city's central core. But it slid into its designated mooring point with exquisite delicacy. Bright red symbols flashed onto the otherwise blank white hull, signifying airlocks, cargo ports, and umbilical sockets. Gangways were swung out from the arm to align with the doors and ports. Dockers, supervised by proctors and city officials, scrambled along the precarious connecting ways and attempted to fix magnetic berthing stays onto the shuttle's hull. The magnetics slid off the hull. They tried adhesive grips next, and these were no more successful. After that, the dockers shrugged their shoulders and made exasperated gestures in the direction of the shuttle. The roar of the crowd had died down a little by now. Naki felt the anticipation as well. She watched as an entourage of VIPs moved to the berthing position, led by a smooth, faintly cherubic individual that Naki recognized as Tak Tonburi, the mayor of Umingmaktak and presiding chair of the Snowflake Council. Tak Tonburi was happily overweight and had a permanent cowlick of black hair, like an inverted question mark tattooed upon his forehead. His cheeks and brow were mottled with pale green. Next to him was the altogether leaner frame of Jota Sivaraksa. It was no surprise that Dr. Sivaraksa should be here today, for the Moat Project was one of the most significant activities of the entire Snowflake Council. His iron-gray eyes flashed this way and that, as if constantly triangulating the positions of enemies and allies alike. The group was accompanied by armed, ceremonially dressed proctors and a triad of martial servitors. Their articulation points and sensor apertures were lathered in protective sterile grease to guard against rot. Though they tried to hide it, Naki could tell that the VIPs were nervous. They moved a touch too confidently, making their trepidation all the more evident. The red door symbol at the end of the gangway pulsed brighter, and a section of the hull puckered open. Naki squinted, but even through the binoculars it was difficult to make out anything other than red-lit gloom. Tak Tonburi and his officials stiffened. A sketchy figure emerged from the shuttle, lingered on the threshold, and then stepped with immense slowness into full sunlight. The crowd's reaction, and to some extent Naki's own, was double-edged. There was a moment of relief that the messages from orbit had not been outright lies. Then there was an equally brief tang of shock at the actual appearance of Captain Moreau. The man was at least a third taller than anyone Naki had ever seen in her life, and yet commensurately thinner, his seemingly brittle frame contained within a jade-colored mechanical exoskeleton of ornate design. The skeleton lent his movements something of the lethargic quality of a stick insect. Tak Tonburi was the first to speak. His amplified voice boomed out across the 6 arms of Umingmaktak, echoing off the curved surfaces of the multiple vacuum bladders that held the city aloft. Float cams jostled for the best camera angle, swarming around him like pollen-crazed bees. "Captain Moreau, may I introduce myself? I am Tak Tonburi, mayor of Umingmaktak Snowflake City and incumbent chairman of the Snowflake Council of all Turquoise. It is my pleasure to welcome you, your crew and passengers to Umingmaktak and to Turquoise itself. You have my word that we will do all in our power to make your visit as pleasant as possible." The Ultra moved closer to the official. The door to the shuttle remained open behind him. Naki's binocs picked out red hologram serpents on the jade limbs of the skeleton. The Ultra's own voice boomed at least as loud, but emanated from the shuttle rather than Umingmaktak's public address system. "People of greenish-blue," the captain hesitated, then tapped one of the stalks projecting from his helmet. "People of Turquoise, Chairman Tonburi, thank you for your welcome and for your kind permission to assume orbit. We have accepted it with gratitude. You have my word, as captain of the light-hugger Voice of Evening, that we will abide by the strict terms of your generous offer of hospitality." His mouth continued to move even during the pauses, Naki noticed. The translation system was lagging. "You have my additional guarantee that no harm will be done to your world, and Turquoise law will be presumed to apply to the occupants of all bodies and vessels in your atmosphere. All traffic between my ship and your world will be subject to the authorization of the Snowflake Council, and any member of the Council will, under the auspices of the Council, be permitted to visit the Voice of Evening at any time, subject to the availability of a suitable conveyance." The captain paused and looked at Tak Tonburi expectantly. The mayor wiped a nervous hand across his brow, smoothing his kiss curl into obedience. "Thank you, Captain." Tak Tonburi's eyes flashed to the other members of the reception party. "Your terms are, of course, more than acceptable. You have my word that we will do all in our power to assist you and your crew, and that we will do our utmost to ensure that the forthcoming negotiations of trade proceed in an equable manner, and in such a way that both parties will be satisfied upon their conclusion." The captain did not respond immediately, allowing an uncomfortable pause to draw itself out. Naki wondered if it was really the fault of the software, or whether Moreau was just playing on Tak Tonburi's evident nervousness. "Of course," the Ultra said finally. "Of course. My sentiments entirely, Chairman Tonburi. Perhaps now wouldn't be a bad time to introduce my guests." On his cue, 3 new figures emerged from the Voice of Evening's shuttle. Unlike the Ultra, they could almost have passed for ordinary citizens of Turquoise. There were 2 men and 1 woman, all of approximately normal height and build. They all had long hair, tied back in elaborate clasps. Their clothes were brightly colored, fashioned from many separate fabrics of yellow, orange, red, and russet, and various permutations of the same warm sunset shades. The clothes billowed around them, rippling in the light afternoon breeze. All 3 members of the party wore silver jewelry, far more than was customary on Turquoise. They wore it on their fingers, in their hair, hanging from their ears. The woman was the first to speak, her voice booming out from the shuttle's PA system. "Thank you, Captain Moreau. Thank you also, Chairman Tonburi. We are delighted to be here. I am Amisha Crane, and I speak for the Vahishta Foundation. Vahishta is a modest scientific organization with its origins in the cometary prefectures of the Haven Demarchi. Lately, we have been expanding our realm of interest to encompass other solar systems, such as this one." Crane gestured at the 2 men who had accompanied her from the shuttle. "My associates are Simon Matsubara and Raphael Weir. There are another 17 of us aboard the shuttle. Captain Moreau carried us here as paying passengers aboard the Voice of Evening, and as such, Vahishta gladly accepts all the terms already agreed upon." Tak Tonburi looked even less sure of himself. "Of course, we welcome your interest. A scientific organization, did you say?" "One with a special interest in the study of the jugglers," Amisha Crane answered. She was the most strikingly attractive member of the trio, with fine cheekbones and a wide, sensual mouth that always seemed on the point of smiling or laughing. Naki felt that the woman was sharing something with her, something private and amusing. Doubtless everyone in the crowd felt the same vague sense of complicity. Crane continued, "We have no pattern jugglers in our own system, but that hasn't stopped us from focusing our research on them, collating the data available from the worlds where juggler studies are ongoing. We've been doing this for decades, sifting inference and theory, guesswork and intuition. Haven't we, Simon?" The man nodded. He had sallow skin and a fixed, quizzical expression. "No 2 juggler worlds are precisely alike," Simon Matsubara said, his voice as clear and confident as the woman's. "And no 2 juggler worlds have been studied by precisely the same mix of human socio-political factions. That means that we have a great many variables to take into consideration. Despite that, we believe we have identified similarities that may have been overlooked by the individual research teams. They may even be very important similarities with repercussions for wider humanity. But in the absence of our own jugglers, it is difficult to test our theories. That's where Turquoise comes in." The other man, Naki recalled his name as Raphael Weir, began to speak. "Turquoise has been largely isolated from the rest of human space for the better part of 2 centuries. "We're aware of this," said Jota Sivaraksa. It was the first time any member of the entourage other than Tak Tonburi had spoken. To Naki he sounded irritated, though he was doing his best to hide it. "You don't share your findings with the other juggler worlds," said Amisha Crane. "Nor, to the best of our knowledge, do you intercept their cultural transmissions. The consequence is that your research on the jugglers has been untainted by any outside considerations, the latest fashionable theory, the latest groundbreaking technique. You prefer to work in scholarly isolation." "We're an isolationist world in other respects," Tak Tonburi said. Believe it or not, it actually rather suits us." "Quite," Crane said, with a hint of sharpness. "But the point remains. Your jugglers are an uncontaminated resource. When a swimmer enters the ocean, their own memories and personality may be absorbed into the juggler sea. The prejudices and preconceptions that swimmer carries inevitably enter the ocean in some shape or form, diluted, confused, but nonetheless present in some form. And when the next swimmer enters the sea and opens their mind to communion, what they perceive, what they ken in your own terminology, is irrevocably tainted by the preconceptions introduced by the previous swimmer. They may experience something that confirms their deepest suspicion about the nature of the jugglers, but they can't be sure that they aren't simply picking up the mental echoes of the last swimmer, or the swimmer before that." Jota Sivaraksa nodded. "What you say is undoubtedly true, but we've had just as many cycles of fashionable theory as anyone else. Even within Umingmaktok, there are a dozen different research teams, each with their own outlook." "We accept that," Crane said, with an audible sigh. "But the degree of contamination is slight compared to other worlds. Vahishta lacks the resources for a trip to a previously unvisited juggler world, so the next best thing is to visit one that has suffered the smallest degree of human cultural pollution. Turquoise fits the bill." Taktonburi held the moment before responding, playing to the crowd again. Naki rather admired the way he did it. "Good. I'm very pleased to hear it. And might I ask just what it is about our ocean that we can offer you?" "Nothing except the ocean itself," said Amisha Crane. "We simply wish to join you in its study. If you will allow it, members of the Vahishta Foundation will collaborate with native turquoise scientists and study teams. They will shadow them and offer interpretation or advice when requested. Nothing more than that." "That's all?" Crane smiled. "That's all. It's not as if we're asking the world, is it?" Naki remained in Umingmaktok for 3 days after the arrival, visiting friends and taking care of business for the moat. The newcomers had departed, taking their shuttle to one of the other snowflake cities. Prachuap, or the recently married Kaanak Pangnirtung, perhaps, where a smaller but no less worthy group of city dignitaries would welcome Captain Moreau and his passengers. In Umingmaktok, the booths and bunting were packed away and normal business resumed. Litter abounded. Worm dealers did brisk business, as they always did during times of mild gloom. There were far fewer transport craft moored to the arms, and no sign at all of the intense media presence of a few days before. Tourists had gone back to their home cities, and the children were safely back in school. Between meetings, Naki sat in the midday shade of half-empty restaurants and bars, observing the same puzzled disappointment in every face she encountered. Deep down, she felt it herself. For 2 years they had been free to imprint every possible fantasy on the approaching ship. Even if the newcomers had arrived with less than benign intent, there would still have been something interesting to talk about, the possibility, however remote, that one's own life might be about to become drastically more exciting. But now none of that was going to happen. Undoubtedly, Naki would be involved with the visitors at some point, allowing them to visit the moat or one of the outlying research zones she managed, but there would be nothing life-changing. She thought back to that night with Mina, when they had heard the news. Everything had changed then. Mina had died, and Naki had found herself taking her sister's role in the moat. She had risen to the challenge, and promotions had followed with gratifying swiftness, until she was in effective charge of the moat's entire scientific program. But that sense of closure she had yearned for was still absent. The men she had slept with, men who were almost always swimmers, had never provided it, and by turns they had each lost patience with her, realizing that they were less important to her as people than what they represented as connections to the sea. It had been months since her last romance, and once Naki had recognized the way her own subconscious was drawing her back to the sea, she had drawn away from contact with swimmers. She had been drifting since then, daring to hope that the newcomers would allow her some measure of tranquility. but the newcomers had not supplied it. She supposed she would have to find it elsewhere. On the fourth day, Naki returned to the moat on a high-speed dirigible. She arrived near sunset, dropping down from high altitude to see the structure winking back at her, a foreshortened ellipse of gray-white ceramic lying against the sea like some vast discarded bracelet. From horizon to horizon there were several jugular nodes visible, webbed together by the faintest of filaments. To Naki they looked like motes of ink spreading into blotting paper, but there were also smaller dabs of green within the moat itself. The structure was 20 kilometers wide, and now it was nearly finished. Only a narrow channel remained where the two ends of the bracelet did not quite meet. 100-meter-wide, sheer-sided aperture, flanked on either side by tall, ramshackle towers of accommodation modules, equipment sheds, and construction cranes. To the north, strings of heavy cargo dirigibles ferried processed ore and ceramic cladding from Naratiwat Atoll, lowering it down to the construction teams on the moat. They had been working here for nearly 20 years. The 100 meters of the moat that projected above the water was only 1/10 of the full structure, a kilometer-high ring resting on the seabed. In a matter of months, the gap, little more than a notch in the top of the moat, would be sealed, closed off by immense, hermetically tight sea doors. The process would necessarily be slow and delicate, for what was being attempted here was not simply the closing off of part of the sea. The moat was an attempt to isolate a part of the living ocean, sealing off a community of pattern jugular organisms within its impervious ceramic walls. The high-speed dirigible swung low over the aperture. The thick green waters streaming through the cut had the phlegmatic consistency of congealing blood. Thick, ropey tendrils permitted information transfer between the external sea and the cluster of small nodes within the moat. Swimmers were constantly present, either inside or outside the moat, kenning the state of the sea and establishing that the usual jugular processes continued unabated. The dirigible docked with one of the two flanking towers. Naki stepped out, back onto the hectic corridors and office spaces of the project building. It felt distinctly odd to be back on absolutely firm ground. Although one was seldom aware of it, Umingmaktok was never quite still. No snowflake city or airship ever was. But she would get used to it. In a few hours she would be immersed in her work, having to think of a dozen different things at once, finessing solution pathways, balancing budgets against quality, dealing with personality clashes and minor turf wars, and perhaps, if she was very lucky, managing an hour or two of pure research. Aside from the science, none of it was particularly challenging, but it kept her mind off other things. And after a few days of that, the arrival of the visitors would begin to seem like a bizarre, irrelevant interlude in an otherwise monotonous dream. She supposed that 2 years ago she would have been grateful for that. Life could indeed continue much as she had always imagined it would. But when she arrived at her office, there was a message from Dr. Sivaraksa. He needed to speak to her urgently. Dr. Jota Sivaraksa's office on the moat was a good deal less spacious than his quarters in Umingmaktok, but the view was superb. His accommodation was perched halfway up one of the towers that flanked the cut through the moat, buttressed out from the main mass of prefabricated modules like a partially opened desk drawer. Dr. Sivaraksa was writing notes when she arrived. For long moments, Naki lingered at the sloping window, watching the construction activity hundreds of meters below. Railed machines and helmeted workers toiled on the flat upper surface of the moat, moving raw materials and equipment to the assembly sites. Above, the sky was a perfect cobalt blue, marred now and then by the passing green-stained hull of a cargo dirigible. The sea beyond the moat had the dimpled texture of expensive leather. Dr. Sivaraksa cleared his throat, and when Naki turned, he gestured at the vacant seat on the opposite side of his desk. "Life treating you well?" "Can't complain, sir." "And work?" "No particular problems that I'm aware of." "Good, good." Sivaraxa made a quick, cursive annotation in the notebook he had opened on his desk, then slid it beneath the smoky gray cube of a paperweight. "How long has it been now?" "Since what, sir?" "Since your sister, since Mina." He seemed unable to complete the sentence, substituting a spiraling gesture made with his index finger. His finely boned hands were marbled with veins of olive green. Naki eased into her seat. 2 years, sir." "And you're over it?" "I wouldn't exactly say I'm over it, no. But life goes on, like they say. Actually, I was hoping—" Naki had been about to tell him how she had imagined the arrival of the visitors would close that chapter, but she doubted she would be able to convey her feelings in a way Dr. Sivaraxa would understand. "Well, I was hoping I'd have put it all behind me by now." "I knew another conformal, you know. Fellow from Gajoa. Made it into the elite swimmer corps before anyone had the foggiest idea. It's never been proven that Mina was conformal, sir." "No, but the signs were there, weren't they? To one degree or another, we're all subject to symbolic invasion by the ocean's microorganisms, but conformals show an unusual degree of susceptibility. On one hand, it's as if their own bodies actively invite the invasion, shutting down the usual inflammatory or foreign cell rejection mechanisms. On the other, the ocean seems to tailor its messengers for maximum effectiveness, as if the jugglers have selected a specific target they wish to absorb. Mina had very strong fungal patterns, did she not?" "I've seen worse," Naki said, which was not entirely a lie. "But not, I suspect, in anyone who ever attempted to commune. I understand you had ambitions to join the swimmer corps yourself?" "Before all that happened." "I understand. And now?" Naki had never told anyone that she had joined Mina in the swimming incident. The truth was that even if she had not been present at the time of Mina's death, her encounter with the rogue mind would have put her off entering the ocean for life. "It isn't for me. That's all." Jota Sivaraxa nodded gravely. "A wise choice. Aptitude or not, you'd have almost certainly been filtered out of the swimmer corps. A direct genetic connection to a conformal, even an unproven conformal, would be too much of a risk." "That's what I assumed, sir." "Does it trouble you, Naki?" She was wearying of this. She had work to do, deadlines to meet that Sivaraxa himself had imposed. "Does what trouble me?" He nodded at the sea. Now that the play of light had shifted minutely, it looked less like dimpled leather than a sheet of beaten bronze. "The thought that Mina might still be out there, in some sense." "It might trouble me if I were a swimmer, sir. Other than that, no, I can't say that it does. My sister died. That's all that mattered." "Swimmers have occasionally reported encountering minds, essences of the lost, Naki. The impressions are often acute. The conformed leave their mark on the ocean at a deeper, more permanent level than the impressions left behind by mere swimmers. One senses that there must be a purpose to this." "That wouldn't be for me to speculate, sir." "No." He glanced down at the compad and then tapped his forefinger against his upper lip. "No, of course not. Well, to the matter at hand." She interrupted him. "You swam once, sir?" "Yes. Yes, I did." The moment stretched. She was about to say something, anything, when Sivaraxa continued. "I had to stop for medical reasons. Otherwise, I suppose I'd have been in the swimmer corps for a good deal longer, at least until my hands started turning green." "What was it like?" "Astonishing. Beyond anything I'd expected." "Did they change you?" At that he smiled. "I never thought that they did, until now. After my last swim, I went through all the usual neurological and psychological tests. They found no anomalies, no indications that the jugglers had imprinted any hints of alien personality or rewired my mind to think in an alien way." Sivaraxa reached across the desk and held up the smoky cube that Naki had taken for a paperweight. "This came down from the Voice of Evening. Examine it." Naki peered into the milky gray depths of the cube. Now that she saw it closely, she realized that there were things embedded within the translucent matrix. There were chains of unfamiliar symbols intersecting at right angles. They resembled the complex white scaffolding of a building. "What is it?" "Mathematics. Actually, a mathematical argument, a proof, if you like. Conventional mathematical notation, no matter how arcane, has evolved so that it can be written down on a two-dimensional surface like paper or a readout. This is a three-dimensional syntax, liberated from that constraint. It's enormously richer, enormously more elegant." The cube tumbled in Sivaraxa's hand. He was smiling. "No one could make head or tail of it. Yet when I looked at it for the first time, I nearly dropped it in shock. It made perfect sense to me. Not only did I understand the theorem, but I also understood the point of it. It's a joke, Naki, a pun. This mathematics is rich enough to embody humor, and understanding that is the gift they left me. It was sitting in my mind for 28 years, like an egg waiting to hatch." Abruptly, Sivaraxa placed the cube back on the table. "Something's come up," he said. From somewhere came the distant, prolonged thunder of a dirigible discharging its cargo of processed ore. It must have been one of the last consignments. "Something, sir?" "They've asked to see the moat." "They?" "Crane and her Vahishta mob. They've requested an oversight of all major scientific centers on Turquoise, and naturally enough, we're on the list. They'll be visiting us, spending a couple of days seeing what we've achieved." "I'm not too surprised that they've asked to visit, sir." "No, but I was hoping we'd have a few months' grace. We don't. They'll be here in a week." "That's not necessarily a problem for us, is it?" "It mustn't become one," Sivaraxa said. "I'm putting you in charge of the visit, Naki. You'll be the interface between Crane's group and the moat. That's quite a responsibility, you understand. A mistake, the tiniest gaffe, could undermine our standing with the Snowflake Council." He nodded at the compad. "Our budgetary position is tenuous. Frankly, I'm in Taktonburi's lap. We can't afford any embarrassments." "No, sir." She certainly did understand. The job was a poisoned chalice, or at the least a chalice with a strong potential to become poisoned. If she succeeded, if the visit went smoothly with no hitches, Sivaraxa could still take much of the credit for it. If it went wrong, on the other hand, the fault would be categorically hers. "One more thing." Sivaraxa reached under his desk and produced a brochure that he slid across to her. The brochure was marked with a prominent silver snowflake motif. It was sealed with red foil. "Open it. You have clearance." "What is it, sir?" "A security report on our new friends. One of them has been behaving a bit oddly. You'll need to keep an eye on him." For inscrutable reasons of their own, the liaison committee had decided she would be introduced to Amisha Crane and her associates a day before the official visit, when the party was still in Sukhothai Sanikiluak. The journey there took the better part of 2 days, even allowing for the legs she took by high-speed dirigible or the aging, unreliable trans-atoll railway line between Narathiwat and Cape Dorset. She arrived at Sukhothai Sanikiluak in a velvety purple twilight, catching the tail end of a fireworks display. The two snowflake cities had only been married 3 weeks, so the arrival of the off-worlders was an excellent pretext for prolonging the celebrations. Naki watched the fireworks from a civic landing stage perched halfway up Sukhothai's core, starbursts and cataracts of scarlet, indigo, and intense emerald green brightening the sky above the vacuum bladders. The colors reminded her of the organisms that she and Mina had seen in the wake of their airship. The recollection left her suddenly sad and drained, convinced that she had made a terrible mistake by accepting this assignment. "Naki?" It was Taktonburi, coming out to meet her on the balcony. They had already exchanged messages during the journey. He was dressed in full civic finery, and appeared more than a little drunk. "Chairman Tonburi?" Good of you to come here, Naki." She watched his eyes map her contours with scientific rigor, lingering here and there around regions of particular interest. "Enjoying the show?" "You certainly seem to be, sir." Yes. Always had a thing about fireworks." He pressed a drink into her hand, and together they watched the display come to its mildly disappointing conclusion. There was a lull then, but Naki noticed that the spectators on the other balconies were reluctant to leave, as if waiting for something. Presently, a stunning display of three-dimensional images appeared, generated by powerful projection apparatus in the Voice of Evening's shuttle. Above Sukhothai Sanikiluak, Chinese dragons as large as mountains fought epic battles. Sea monsters convulsed and writhed in the night. Celestial citadels burned. Hosts of purple-winged fiery angels fell from the heavens in tightly knit squadrons, clutching arcane instruments of music or punishment. A marbled giant rose from the sea, as if woken from some eons-long slumber. It was very, very impressive. "Bastards," Tonburi muttered. "Sir?" "Bastards," he said, louder this time. "We know they're better than us, but do they have to keep reminding us?" He ushered her into the reception chamber where the Vahishta visitors were being entertained. The return indoors had a magical sharpening effect on his senses. Naki suspected that the ability to turn drunkenness on and off like a switch must be one of the most hallowed of diplomatic skills. He leaned toward her confidentially. "Did Jota mention any security considerations, Chairman?" "Yes, I think I got the message." "It's probably nothing, only—" "I understand. Better safe than sorry." He winked, touching a finger against the side of his nose. "Precisely." The interior was bright after the balcony. 20 Vahishta delegates were standing in a huddle near the middle of the room. The captain was absent. Little had been seen of Moreau since the shuttle's arrival in Umingmaktok, but the delegates were talking to a clutch of local bigwigs, none of whom Naki recognized. Tonburi steered her into the fray, oblivious to the conversations that were taking place. "Ladies and gentlemen, might I introduce Naki Okpik? Naki oversees the scientific program on the moat. She'll be our host for the visit to our project." "Ah, Naki." Amisha Crane leaned over and shook her hand. "A pleasure. I just read your papers on information propagation methods in Class 3 nodes. Erudite." "They were collaborative works," Naki said. "I really can't take too much credit." "Ah, but you can. All of you can. You achieved those findings with the minimum of resources, and you made very creative use of some extremely simplistic numerical methods." "We muddled through," Naki said. Crane nodded enthusiastically. "It must give you a great sense of satisfaction." Tak Tonburi said, "It's a philosophy, that's all. We conduct our science in isolation, and we enjoy only limited communication with other colonies. As a social model, it has its disadvantages, but it means we aren't forever jealous of what they're achieving on some other world that happens to be a few decades ahead of us because of an accident of history or location. We think that the benefits outweigh the costs." "Well, it seems to work," Crane said. "You have a remarkably stable society here, Chairman. Verging on the utopian, some might say." Tak Tonburi caressed his cowlick. "We can't complain." "Nor can we," said the man Naki recognized as quizzical-faced Simon Matsubara. "If you hadn't enforced this isolation, your own juggler research would have been as hopelessly compromised as everywhere else." "But the isolation isn't absolute, is it?" The voice was quiet but commanding. Naki followed the voice to the speaker. It was Raphael Weir, the man who had been identified as a possible security risk. Of the three who had emerged from Moreau's shuttle, he was the least remarkable-looking, possessing the kind of amorphous face that would allow him to blend in with almost any crowd. Had her attention not been drawn to him, he would have been the last one she noticed. He was not unattractive, but there was nothing particularly striking or charismatic about his looks. According to the security dossier, he had made a number of efforts to break away from the main party of the delegation while they had been visiting research stations. They could have been accidents. One or two other party members had become separated at other times, but it was beginning to look a little too deliberate. "No," Tonburi answered. "We're not absolute isolationists, or we'd never have given permission for the Voice of Evening to assume orbit around Turquoise. But we don't solicit passing traffic either. Our welcome is as warm as anyone's, we hope, but we don't encourage visitors." "Are we the first to visit since your settlement?" Weir asked. "The first starship?" Tonburi shook his head. "No, but it's been a number of years since the last one." "Which was?" "The Pelican in Impiety, a century ago." "An amusing coincidence, then," Weir said. Tonburi narrowed his eyes. "Coincidence?" "The Pelican's next port of call was Haven, if I'm not mistaken. It was en route from Zion, but it made a trade stopover around Turquoise." He smiled. "And we have come from Haven, so history already binds our two worlds, albeit tenuously." Tonburi's eyes narrowed. He was trying to read Weir, and evidently failing. "We don't talk about the Pelican too much. There were technical benefits, vacuum bladder production methods, information technologies, but there was also a fair bit of unpleasantness. The wounds haven't entirely healed." "Let's hope this visit will be remembered more fondly," Weir said. Amisha Crane nodded, fingering one of the items of silver jewelry in her hair. "Agreed. All the indications are favorable at the very least. We've arrived at a most auspicious time." She turned to Naki. "I find the Moat project fascinating, and I'm sure I speak for the entire Vahishta delegation. I may as well tell you that no one else has attempted anything remotely like it. Tell me, scientist to scientist, do you honestly think it will work?" "We won't know until we try," Naki said. Any other answer would have been politically hazardous. Too much optimism, and the politicians would have started asking just why the expensive project was needed in the first place. Too much pessimism, and they would ask exactly the same question. "Fascinating all the same." Crane's expression was knowing, as if she understood Naki's predicament perfectly. "I understand that you're very close to running the first experiment?" "Given that it's taken us 20 years to get this far, yes, we're close. But we're still looking at 3 to 4 months, maybe longer. It's not something we want to rush." "That's a great pity," Crane said, turning now to Tonburi. "In 3 to 4 months we might be on our way. Still, it would have been something to see, wouldn't it?" Tonburi leaned toward Naki. The alcohol in his breath was a fog of cheap vinegar. "I suppose there wouldn't be any chance of accelerating the schedule, would there?" "Out of the question, I'm afraid," Naki said. "That's just too bad," said Amisha Crane. Still toying with her jewelry, she turned to the others. "But we mustn't let a little detail like that spoil our visit, must we?" They returned to the moat using the Voice of Evening's shuttle. There was another civic reception to be endured upon arrival, but it was a much smaller affair than the one in Sukhothai Sanikiluak. Dr. Jota Sivaraksa was there, of course, and once Naki had dealt with the business of introducing the party to him, she was able to relax for the first time in many hours, melting into the corner of the room and watching the interaction between visitors and locals with a welcome sense of detachment. Naki was tired and had difficulty keeping her eyes open. She saw everything through a sleepy blur, the delegates surrounding Sivaraksa like pillars of fire, the fabric of their costumes rippling with the slightest movement, reds and russets and chrome yellows dancing like sparks or sheets of flame. Naki left as soon as it was polite to do so, and when she reached her bed she fell immediately into troubled sleep, dreaming of squadrons of purple-winged angels falling from the skies, and of the great giant rising from the depths, clawing the seaweed and kelp of ages from his eyes. In the morning she awoke without really feeling refreshed. Anemic light pierced the slats on her window. She was not due to meet the delegates again for another 3 or 4 hours, so there was time to turn over and try and catch some proper sleep. But she knew from experience that it would be futile. She got up. To her surprise, there was a new message on her console from Jota Sivaraksa. What, she wondered, did he have to say to her that he could not have said at the reception, or later this morning? She opened the message and read. "Sivaraksa," she said to herself. "Are you insane? It can't be done." The message informed her that there had been a change of plan. The first closure of the sea doors would be attempted in 2 days, while the delegates were still on the moat. It was pure madness. They were months away from that. Yes, the doors could be closed. The basic machinery for doing that was in place. And yes, the doors could be hermetically tight for at least 100 hours after closure. But nothing else was ready. The sensitive monitoring equipment, the fail-safe subsystems, the backups, none of that would be in place and operational for many weeks. Then there was supposed to be at least 6 weeks of testing, slowly building up to the event itself. To do it in 2 days made no sense at all, except to a politician. At best, all they would learn was whether or not the jugglers had remained inside the moat when the door was closed. They would learn nothing about how the data flow was terminated, or how the internal connections between the nodes adapted to the loss of contact with the wider ocean. Naki swore and hit the console. She wanted to blame Sivaraksa, but she knew that was unfair. Sivaraksa had to keep the politicians happy, or the whole project would be endangered. He was just doing what he had to do, and he almost certainly liked it even less than she did. Naki pulled on shorts and a T-shirt and found some coffee in one of the adjoining mess rooms. The moat was deserted, quiet except for the womb-like throb of generators and air circulation systems. A week ago it would have been as noisy now as at any other time of day, for the construction had continued around the clock. But the heavy work was done now. The last ore dirigible had arrived while Naki was away. All that remained was the relatively light work of completing the moat's support subsystems. Despite what Sivaraksa had said in his message, there was really very little additional work needed to close the doors. Even 2 days of frantic activity would make no difference to the usefulness of the stunt. When she had judged her state of mind to be calmer, she returned to her room and called Sivaraksa. It was still far too early, but seeing as the bastard had already ruined her day, she saw no reason not to reciprocate. "Naki?" His silver hair was a sleep-matted mess on the screen. "I take it you got my message?" "You didn't think I'd take it lying down, did you?" "I don't like it any more than you do. But I see the political necessity." "Do you? This isn't like switching a light on and off, Jota." His eyes widened at the familiarity, but she pressed on regardless. "If we screw up the first time, there might never be a second chance. The jugglers have to play along. Without them, all you've got here is a very expensive mid-ocean refueling point. Does that make political sense to you?" He pushed green fingers through the mess of his hair. "Have some breakfast, get some fresh air, then come to my office. We'll talk about it then." "I've had breakfast, thanks very much." "Then get the fresh air. You'll feel better for it." Sivaraksa rubbed his eyes. "You're not very happy about this, are you?" "It's bloody madness. And the worst thing is you know it." "And my hands are tied. 10 years from now, Naki, you'll be sitting in my place having to make similar decisions. And 10 to 1 there'll be some idealistic young scientist telling you what a hopeless piece of deadwood you are." He managed a weary smile. "Mark my words, because I want you to remember this conversation when it happens." "There's nothing I can do to stop this, is there?" "I'll be in my office in—" Sivaraksa glanced at the clock. 30 minutes. We can talk about it properly then." "There's nothing to talk about." But even as she said that, she knew she sounded petulant and inflexible. Sivaraksa was right. It was impossible to manage a project as complex and expensive as the moat without a degree of compromise. Naki decided that Sivaraksa's advice, at least the part about getting some fresh air, was worth heeding. She descended a helical staircase until she reached the upper surface of the moat's ring-shaped wall. The concrete was cold beneath her bare feet, and a pleasant, cool breeze caressed her legs and arms. The sky had brightened on one horizon. Machines and supplies were arranged neatly on the upper surface, ready for use, although further construction would be halted until the delegates completed their visit. Stepping nimbly over the tracks, conduits, and cables that crisscrossed each other on the upper surface, Naki walked to the side. A high railing, painted in high-visibility, rot-resistant sealer, fenced the inner part of the moat. She touched it to make sure it was dry, then leaned over. The distant side of the moat was a colorless thread 20 kilometers away, like a very low wall of sea mist. What could be done in 2 days? Nothing. Or at least nothing compared to what had always been planned. But if the new schedule was a fait accompli, and that was the message she was getting from Sivaraxa, then it was her responsibility to find a way to squeeze some scientific return from the event. She looked down at the cut, and at the many spindly gantries and catwalks that spanned the aperture or hung some way toward the center of the moat. Perhaps if she arranged for some standard-issue probes to be prepared today, the type dropped from dirigibles. Naki's eyes darted around, surveying fixtures and telemetry conduits. It would be hard work to get them in place in time, and even harder to get them patched into some kind of real-time acquisition system, but it was doable, just barely. The data quality would be laughable compared to the super-sensitive instruments that were going to be installed over the next few months, but crude was a lot better than nothing at all. She laughed aloud. An hour ago she would have stuck pins into herself rather than collaborate in this kind of fiasco. Naki walked along the railing until she reached a pair of pillar-mounted binoculars. They were smeared with rot protection. She wiped the lens and eyepieces clean with a rag that was tied to the pedestal, then swung the binoculars in a slow arc, panning across the dark circle of water trapped within the moat. Only vague patches of what Naki would have called open water were visible. The rest was either a verdant porridge of jugular organisms or fully grown masses of organized floating matter, linked together by trunks and veins of the same green biomass. The latest estimate was that there were 3 small nodes within the ring. The smell was atrocious, but that was an excellent sign as well. It correlated strongly with the density of organisms in the nodes. She had experienced that smell many times, but it never failed to slam her back to that morning when Mina had died. As much as the pattern jugglers knew anything, they were surely aware of what was planned here. They had drunk the minds of the swimmers who had already entered the sea near or within the moat, and not one of those swimmers was ignorant of the project's ultimate purpose. It was possible that the knowledge simply couldn't be parsed into a form the aliens would understand. But Naki considered that unlikely. The closure of the moat would be about as stark a concept as one could imagine. If nothing else, geometry was the one thing the jugglers did understand. And yet the aliens chose to remain within the closing moat, hinting that they would tolerate the final closure that would seal them off from the rest of the ocean. Perhaps they were not impressed. Perhaps they knew that the event would not rob them of every channel of communication, but only the chemical medium of the ocean. Sprites and other airborne organisms would still be able to cross the barrier. It was impossible to tell. The only way to know was to complete the experiment, to close the massive sea doors, and see what happened. She leaned back, taking her eyes from the binoculars. Now Naki saw something unexpected. It was a glint of hard white light scudding across the water within the moat. Naki squinted, but still she could not make out the object. She swung the binoculars hard around, got her eyes behind them, and then zigzagged until something flashed through the field of view. She backed up and locked onto it. It was a boat, and there was someone in it. She keyed in the image zoom stabilize function, and the craft swelled to clarity across a clear kilometer of sea. The craft was a ceramic hulled vessel of the type that the swimmer teams used, 5 or 6 meters from bow to stern. The person sat behind a curved spray shield, their hands on the handlebars of the control pillar. An inboard thruster propelled the boat without ever touching water. The figure was difficult to make out, but the billowing orange clothes left no room for doubt. It was one of the Vahishta delegates, and Naki fully expected it to be Raphael Weir. He was headed toward the closest node. For an agonizing few moments she did not know what to do. He was going to attempt to swim, she thought, just like she and Mina had done. And he would be no better prepared for the experience. She had to stop him somehow. He would reach the node in only a few minutes. Naki sprinted back to the tower, breathless when she arrived. She reached a communications post and tried to find the right channel for the boat. But either she was doing it wrong or Weir had sabotaged the radio. What next? Technically, there was a security presence on the moat, especially given the official visit. But what did the security goons know about chasing boats? All their training was aimed at dealing with internal crises, and none of them were competent to go anywhere near an active node. She called them anyway, alerting them to what had happened. Then she called Sivaraksa, telling him the same news. "I think it's Weir," she said. "I'm going to try and stop him." "Naki," he said warningly. "This is my responsibility, Jota. Let me handle it." Naki ran back outside again. The closest elevator down to sea level was out of service. The next one was a kilometer farther around the ring. She didn't have that much time. Instead, she jogged along the line of railings until she reached a break that admitted entry to a staircase that descended the steep inner wall of the moat. The steps and handrails had been helpfully greased with anti-rot just to make her descent more treacherous. There were 500 steps down to sea level, but she took them 2 or 3 at a time, sliding down the handrails until she reached the grilled platforms where the stairways reversed direction. All the while she watched the tiny white speck of the boat, seemingly immobile now that it was so far away, but undoubtedly narrowing the distance to the node with each minute. As she worked her way down, she had plenty of time to think about what was going through the delegate's head. She was sure now that it was Weir. It did not really surprise her that he wanted to swim. It was what everyone who studied the jugglers yearned for. But why make this unofficial attempt now, when a little gentle persuasion would have made it possible anyway? Given Taktonburi's eagerness to please the delegates, it would not have been beyond the bounds of possibility for a swimming expedition to be organized. The Corps would have protested, but just like Naki, they would have been given a forceful lesson in the refined art of political compromise. But evidently Weir hadn't been prepared to wait. It all made sense at any rate. The times when he had dodged away from the party before must all have been abortive attempts to reach the jugglers, but only now had he seen his opportunity. Naki reached the water level, where jetties floated on ceramic-sheathed pontoons. Most of the boats were suspended out of the water on cradles to save their hulls from unnecessary degradation. Fortunately, there was an emergency rescue boat already afloat. Its formerly white hull had the flaking pea-green scab patterning of advanced rot, but it still had a dozen or so hours of seaworthiness in it. Naki jumped aboard, released the boat from its moorings, and fired up the thruster. In a moment she was racing away from the jetty, away from the vast, stained edifice of the moat itself. She steered a course through the least viscous stretches of water, avoiding conspicuous rafts of green matter. She peered ahead through the boat's spray-drenched shield. It had been easy to keep track of Weir's boat when she had been 100 meters higher, but now she kept losing him behind swells or miniature islands of juggler matter. After a minute or so she gave up trying to follow the boat, and instead diverted her concentration to finding the quickest route to the node. She flipped on the radio. "Jota, this is Naki. I'm in the water, closing on Weir." There was a pause, a crackle, then, "What's the status?" She had to shout over the abrasive thump, thump, thump of the boat, even though the thruster was nearly silent. "I'll reach the node in 4 or 5 minutes. Can't see Weir, but I don't think it matters." "We can see him. He's still headed for the node." "Good. Can you spare some more boats in case he decides to make a run for another node?" "They'll be leaving in a minute or so. I'm waking everyone I can." "What about the other delegates?" Sivaraksa did not answer her immediately. "Most are still asleep. I have Amisha Crane and Simon Matsubara in my office, however. Let me speak to them. Just a moment, he said, after the same brief hesitation. Crane here, said the woman. I think I'm chasing Weir. Can you confirm that? He isn't accounted for, she told Naki, but it'll be a few minutes until we can be certain it's him. I'm not expecting a surprise. Weir already had a question mark over him, Amisha. We were waiting for him to try something. Were you? Perhaps it was her imagination, but Crane sounded genuinely surprised. Why? What had he done? You don't know? No. Crane trailed off. He was one of us, Matsubara said. A good delegate. We had no reason to distrust him. Perhaps Naki was imagining this as well, but it almost sounded as if Matsubara had intended to say disciple rather than delegate. Crane came back on the radio. Please do your best to apprehend him, Naki. This is a source of great embarrassment to us. He mustn't do any harm. Naki gunned the boat harder, no longer bothering to avoid the smaller patches of organic matter. No, she said. He mustn't. 3. Something changed ahead. Naki? It was Jota Sivaraksa's voice. What? We've slowed his boat. From our vantage point, it looks as if he's reached the perimeter of the node. He seems to be circumnavigating it. I can't see him yet. He must be picking the best spot to dive in. But it won't work, will it? Sivaraksa asked. There has to be an element of cooperation with the jugglers. They have to invite the swimmer to enter the sea, or nothing happens. Maybe he doesn't realize that, Naki said under her breath. It was of no concern to her how closely Weir was adhering to the usual method of initiating juggler communion. Even if the jugglers did not cooperate, even if all Weir did was flounder in the thick green water, there was no telling the hidden harm that might be done. She had already grudgingly accepted the acceleration of the closure operation. There was no way she was going to tolerate another upset, another unwanted perturbation of the experimental system. Not on her watch. He stopped, Sivaraksa said excitedly. Can you see him yet? Naki stood up in her seat, even though she felt perilously out of balance. Wait. Yes, I think so. I'll be there in a minute or so. What are you going to do? Crane asked. I hesitate to say it, but Weir may not respond to rational argument at this point. Simply requesting that he leave the water won't necessarily work. Do you have a weapon? Yes, Naki said. I'm sitting on it. She did not allow herself to relax, but at least now she felt that the situation was slipping back into her control. She would kill Weir rather than have him contaminate the node. His boat was visible now only as a smudge of white, intermittently popping up between folds and hummocks of shifting green. Her imagination sketched in the details. Weir would be preparing to swim, stripping off until he was naked or nearly so. Perhaps he would feel some kind of erotic charge as he prepared for immersion. She did not doubt that he would be apprehensive, and perhaps he would hesitate on the threshold of the act, teetering on the edge of the boat before committing himself to the water. But a fanatic desire had driven him this far, and she doubted that it would fail him. Naki? Jota? Naki, he's moving again. He didn't enter the water. He didn't even look like he had any intention of swimming. He saw I was coming. I take it he's heading for the next closest node? Perhaps, but Jota Sivaraksa sounded far from certain. She saw the boat again. It was moving fast, much faster than it had appeared before, but that was only because she was now seeing lateral motion. The next node was a distant island framed by the background of the moat's encircling rim. If he headed that way, she would be hard behind him all the way there as well. No matter his desire to swim, he must realize that she could thwart his every attempt. Naki looked back. The twin towers framing the cut were smothered in a haze of sea mist, their geometric details smeared into a vague suggestion of haphazard complexity. They suggested teetering, stratified sea stacks, million-year-old towers of weathered and eroded rock guarding the narrow passage to the open ocean. Beneath them, winking in and out of clarity, she saw 3 or 4 other boats making their way into the moat. The ponderous teardrop of a passenger dirigible was nosing away from the side of one of the towers, the low dawn sun throwing golden highlights along the fluted lines of its gondola. Naki made out the sleek deltoid of the Voice of Evening shuttle, but it was still parked where it had landed. She looked back to the node where Weir had hesitated. Something was happening. The node had become vastly more active than a minute earlier. It resembled a green, steep-sided volcanic island that was undergoing some catastrophic seismic calamity. The entire mass of the node was trembling, rocking and throbbing with an eerie regularity. Concentric swells of disturbed water raced away from it, sickening troughs that made the speeding boat pitch and slide. Naki slowed her boat, some instinct telling her that it was now largely futile to pursue Weir. Then she turned around so that she faced the node properly, and cautiously edged closer, ignoring the nausea she felt as the boat ducked and dived from crest to trough. The node, like all nodes, had always shown a rich surface topology, fused hummocks and tendrils, fabulous domes and minarets, and helter-skelters of organized biomass linked and entangled by a telegraphic system of draping aerial tendrils. In any instant it resembled a human city, or more properly, a fairy-tale human city, that had been efficiently smothered in green moss. The bright, moving motes of sprites dodged through the interstices, the portholes and arches of the urban mass. The metropolitan structure only hinted at the node's Byzantine interior architecture, and much of that could only be glimpsed or implied. But this node was like a city going insane. It was accelerating, running through cycles of urban renewal and redesign with indecent haste. Structures were evolving before Naki's eyes. She had seen change this rapid just before Mina was taken, but normally those kinds of changes happen too slowly to be seen at all, like the daily movement of shadows. The throbbing had decreased, but the flickering change was now throwing out a steady, warm, malodorous breeze. And when she stopped the boat, she dared come no closer now, Naki heard the node. It was like the whisper of a billion forest leaves presaging a summer storm. Whatever was happening here, it was about to become catastrophic. Some fundamental organization had been lost. The changes were happening too quickly, with too little central coordination. Tendrils thrashed like whips, unable to connect to anything. They flailed against each other. Structures were forming and collapsing. The node was fracturing, so that there were 3, 4, perhaps 5 distinct cores of flickering growth. As soon as she had the measure of it, the process shifted it all. Meager light flickered within the epileptic mass. Sprites swarmed in confused flight patterns, orbiting mindlessly between foci. The sound of the node had become a distant shriek. "It's dying," Naki breathed. Weir had done something to it. What, she couldn't guess. But this could not be a coincidence. The shrieking died down. The breeze ceased. The node had stopped its convulsions. She looked at it, hoping against hope that perhaps it had overcome whatever destabilizing influence Weir had introduced. The structures were still misshapen, there was still an impression of incoherence, but the city was inert. The cycling motion of the sprites slowed, and a few of them dropped down into the mass as if to roost. A calm had descended. Then Naki heard another sound. It was lower than anything she had heard before, almost subsonic. It sounded less like thunder than like a very distant, very heated conversation. It was coming from the approximate center of the node. She watched as a smooth green mound rose from the center of the node, resembling a flattened hemisphere. It grew larger by the second, assimilating the malformed structures with quiet indifference. They disappeared into the surface of the mound as if into a wall of fog, but they did not emerge again. The mound only increased its size, rumbling toward Naki. The entire mass of the node was changing into a single, undifferentiated mass. "Jota," she said. "We see it, Nucky. We see it, but we don't understand it." "Weir must have used some kind of weapon against it," she said. "We don't know that he's harmed it. He might just have precipitated a change to a state we haven't documented." "That still makes it a weapon in my book. I'm scared, Jota." "You think I'm not?" Around her the sea was changing. She had forgotten about the submerged tendrils that connected the nodes. They were as thick as hawsers, and now they were writhing and thrashing just beneath the surface of the water. Green-tinged spume lifted into the air. It was as if unseen aquatic monsters were wrestling, locked in some dire-to-the-death contest. "Naki, we're seeing changes in the closest of the two remaining nodes." "No," she said, as if denying it would make any difference. "I'm sorry. Where is Weir?" "We've lost him. There's too much surface disturbance." She realized then what had to be done. The thought arrived in her head with a crashing urgency. "Jota, you have to close the sea doors, now, immediately, before whatever Weir's unleashed has a chance to reach open ocean. That also happens to be Weir's only escape route." Sivaraxa, to his credit, did not argue. "Yes, you're right, I'll start closure. But it will take quite a few minutes." "I know, Jota." She cursed herself for not having thought of this sooner, and cursed Sivaraxa for the same error. But she could hardly blame either of them. Closure had never been something to take lightly. A few hours ago it had been an event months in the future, an experiment to test the willingness of the jugglers to cooperate with human plans. Now it had turned into an emergency amputation, something to be done with brutal haste. She peered at the gap between the towers. At the very least, it would take several minutes for Sivaraxa to initiate closure. It was not simply a matter of pressing a button on his desk, but of rousing 2 or 3 specialist technicians who would have to be immediately convinced that this was not some elaborate hoax. And then the machinery would have to work. The mechanisms that forced the sea doors together had been tested numerous times, but the machinery had never been driven to its limit. The doors had never moved more than a few meters together. Now they would have to work perfectly, closing with watchmaker precision. And when had anything on Turquoise ever worked the first time? There, the tiniest, least perceptible narrowing of the gap. It was all happening with agonizing slowness. She looked back to what remained of the node. The mound had consumed all the biomass available to it, and had now ceased its growth. It was as if a child had sculpted in clay some fantastically intricate model of a city, which a callous adult had then squashed into a single blank mass, erasing all trace of its former complexity. The closest of the remaining nodes was showing something of the same transformation, Naki saw. It was running through the frantic cycle that had presaged the emergence of the mound. She guessed now that the cycle had been the node's attempt to nullify whatever Weir had used against it, like a computer trying to reallocate resources to compensate for some crippling viral attack. She could do nothing for the jugglers now. Naki turned the boat around and headed back toward the cut. The sea doors had narrowed the gap by perhaps a quarter. The changes taking place within the moat had turned the water turbulent, even at the jetty. She hitched the boat to a mooring point and then took the elevator up the side of the wall, preferring to sprint the distance along the top rather than face the climb. By the time she reached the cut, the doors were 3/4 of the way to closure, and to Nucky's immense relief, the machinery had yet to falter. She approached the tower. She had expected to see more people out on the top of the moat, even if she knew that Sivaraxa would still be in his control center. But no one was around. This was just beginning to register as a distinct wrongness when Sivaraxa emerged into daylight, stumbling from the door at the foot of the tower. For an instant she was on the point of calling his name. Then she realized that he was stumbling because he had been injured. His fingers were scarlet with blood, and that he was trying to get away from someone or something. Naki dropped to the ground behind a stack of construction slabs. Through gaps between the slabs, she observed Sivaraxa. He was swatting at something, like a man being chased by a persistent wasp. Something tiny and silver harried him. More than one thing, in fact, a small swarm of them, streaming out the open door. Sivaraxa fell to his knees with a moan, brushing ineffectually at his tormentors. His face was turning red, smeared with his own blood. He slumped on one side. Naki remained frozen with fear. A person stepped from the open door. The figure was garbed in shades of fire. It was Amisha Crane. For an absurd moment, Naki assumed that the woman was about to spring to Sivaraxa's assistance. It was something about her demeanor. Naki found it hard to believe that someone so apparently serene could commit such a violent act. But Crane did not step closer to Sivaraxa. She merely extended her arms before her, with her fingers outspread. She sustained the oddly theatrical gesture, the muscles in her neck standing proud and rigid. The silver things departed Sivaraxa. They swarmed through the air, slowing as they neared Crane. Then, with a startling degree of orchestrated obedience, they slid onto her fingers, locked themselves around her wrists, clasped onto the lobes of her ears. Her jewelry had attacked Sivaraxa. Crane glanced at the man one last time, spun on her heels, and then retreated back into the tower. Naki waited until she was certain the woman was not coming back, then started to emerge from behind the pile of slabs. But Sivaraxa saw her. He said nothing, but his agonized eyes widened enough for Naki to get the warning. She remained where she was, her heart hammering. Nothing happened for another minute. Then something moved above, changing the play of light across the surface of the moat. The voice of evening's shuttle was detaching from the tower, a flicker of white machinery beneath the manta curve of its hull. The shuttle loitered above the cut, as if observing the final moment of closure. Naki heard the huge doors grind shut. Then the shuttle banked and headed over the circular sea, no more than 200 meters above the waves. Some distance out it halted and executed a sharp right-angled turn. Then it resumed its flight, moving concentrically around the inner wall. Sivaraxa closed his eyes. She thought he might have died, but then he opened them again and made the tiniest of nods. Naki left her place of hiding. She crossed the open ground to Sivaraxa in a low, crab-like stoop. She knelt down by him, cradling his head in one hand and holding his own hand with the other. "Jota, what happened?" He managed to answer her. "They turned on us, the 19 other delegates. As soon as—" He paused, summoning strength. "As soon as Weir made his move." "I don't understand." "Join the club," he said, managing a smile. "I need to get you inside," she said. "Won't help. Everyone else is dead, or will be by now. They murdered us all." "No." "Kept me alive until the end, wanted me to give the orders." He coughed. Blood spattered her hand. "I can still get you—" "Naki, save yourself. Get help." She realized that he was about to die. "The shuttle?" "Looking for Weir, I think." "They want Weir back?" "No. Heard them talking. They want Weir dead. They have to be sure." Naki frowned. She understood none of this, or at least her understanding was only now beginning to crystallize. She had labeled Weir as the villain because he had harmed her beloved pattern jugglers. But Crane and her entourage had murdered people, dozens if what Sivaraxa said was correct. They appeared to want Weir dead as well. So what did that make Weir now? "Jota, I have to find Weir. I have to find out why he did this." She looked back toward the center of the moat. The shuttle was continuing its search. "Did your security people get a trace on him again?" Sivaraxa was near the end. She thought he was never going to answer her. "Yes," he said finally. "Yes, they found him again." "And? Any idea where he is? I might still be able to reach him before the shuttle does." "Wrong place." She leaned closer. "Jota?" Wrong place. Amisha's looking in the wrong place. Weir got through the cut. He's in the open ocean. I'm going after him. Perhaps I can stop him. Try, Sivaraxa said. But I'm not sure what difference it will make. I have a feeling, Naki, a very bad feeling. Things are ending. It was good, wasn't it? While it lasted? I haven't given up just yet, Naki said. He found one last nugget of strength. I knew you wouldn't. Right to trust you. One thing, Naki. One thing that might make a difference. If it comes to the worst, that is. Jota? Tak Tonburi told me this. The highest secret known to the Snowflake Council. Aviat, Naki. For a moment she thought she had misheard him, or that he was sliding into delirium. Aviat? The city that sinned against the sea? It was real, Sivaraxa said. There were a number of lifeboats and emergency service craft stored at the top of near vertical slipways, 100 meters above the external sea. She took a small but fast emergency craft with a sealed cockpit, her stomach knotting as the vessel commenced its slide toward the ocean. The boat submerged before resurfacing, boosted up to speed, and then deployed ceramic hydrofoils to minimize the contact between the hull and the water. Naki had no precise heading to follow, but she believed Weir would have followed a reasonably straight line away from the cut, aiming to get as far away from the moat as possible before the other delegates realized their mistake. It would only require a small deviation from that course to take him to the nearest external node, which seemed as likely a destination as any. When she was 20 kilometers from the moat, Naki allowed herself a moment to look back. The structure was a thin white line etched on the horizon, the towers and the now sealed cut faintly visible as interruptions in the line's smoothness. Quills of dark smoke climbed from a dozen spots along the length of the structure. It was too far for Naki to be certain that she saw flames licking from the towers, but she considered it likely. The closest external node appeared over the horizon 15 minutes later. It was nowhere near as impressive as the one that had taken Mina, but it was still a larger, more complex structure than any of the nodes that had formed within the moat. A major urban megalopolis, perhaps, rather than a moderately sized city. Against the skyline, Naki saw spires and rotunda, and coronets of green, bridged by a tracery of elevated tendrils. Sprites were rapidly moving silhouettes. There was motion, but it was largely confined to the flying creatures. The node was not yet showing the frenzied changes she had witnessed within the moat. Had Weir gone somewhere else? She pressed onward, slowing the boat slightly now that the water was thickening with microorganisms, and it was necessary to steer around the occasional larger floating structure. The boat's sonar picked out dozens of submerged tendrils converging on the node, suspended just below the surface. The tendrils reached away in all directions, to the limits of the boat's sonar range. Most would have reached over the horizon, to nodes many hundreds of kilometers away. But it was a topological certainty that some of them had been connected to the nodes inside the moat. Evidently, Weir's contagion had never escaped through the cut. Naki doubted that the doors had closed in time to impede whatever chemical signals were transmitting the fatal message. It was more likely that some latent juggler self-protection mechanism had cut in, the dying nodes sending emergency termination of connection signals that forced the tendrils to sever without human assistance. Naki had just decided that she had guessed wrongly about Weir's plan when she saw a rectilinear furrow gouged right through one of the largest subsidiary structures. The wound was healing itself as she watched. It would be gone in a matter of minutes, but enough remained for her to tell that Weir's boat must have cleaved through the mass very recently. It made sense. Weir had already demonstrated that he had no interest in preserving the pattern jugglers. With renewed determination, Naki gunned the boat forward. She no longer worried about inflicting local damage on the floating masses. There was a great deal more at stake than the well-being of a single node. She felt a warmth on the back of her neck. At the same instant, the sky, sea, and floating structures ahead of her pulsed with a cruel brightness. Her own shadow stretched forward ominously. The brightness faded over the next few seconds, and then she dared to look back, half knowing what she would see. A mass of hot, roiling gas was climbing into the air from the center of the node. It tugged a column of matter beneath it, like the knotted and gnarled spinal column of a horribly swollen brain. Against the mushroom cloud, she saw the tiny moving speck of the delegate's shuttle. A minute later, the sound of the explosion reached her, but although it was easily the loudest thing she had ever heard, it was not as deafening as she had expected. The boat lurched, the sea fumed, and then was still again. She assumed that the moat's wall had absorbed much of the energy of the blast. Suddenly fearful that there might be another explosion, Nucky turned back toward the node. At the same instant she saw Weir's boat, racing perhaps 300 meters ahead of her. He was beginning to curve and slow as he neared the impassable perimeter of the node. Nucky knew that she did not have time to delay. That was when Weir saw her. His boat sped up again, arcing hard away. Nucky steered immediately, certain that her boat was faster and that it was now only a matter of time before she had him. A minute later, Weir's boat disappeared around the curve of the node's perimeter. She might have stood a chance of getting an echo from his hull, but this close to the node all sonar returns were too garbled to be of any use. Nucky steered away, hoping that Weir would make the tactical mistake of striking for another node. In open water he stood no chance at all, but perhaps he understood that as well. She had circumnavigated a third of the node's perimeter when she caught up with him again. He had not tried to run for it. Instead, he had brought the boat to a halt within the comparative shelter of an inlet on the perimeter. He was standing up at the rear of the boat with something small and dark in his hand. Nucky slowed her boat as she approached him. She had popped back the canopy before it occurred to her that Weir might be equipped with the same weapons as Crane. She stood up herself. "Weir?" He smiled. "I'm sorry to have caused so much trouble, but I don't think it could have happened any other way." She let this pass. "That thing in your hand?" "Yes." "It's a weapon, isn't it?" She could see it clearly now. It was merely a glass bauble, little larger than a child's marble. There was something opaque inside it, but she could not tell if it contained fluid or dark crystals. "I doubt that a denial would be very plausible at this point." He nodded, and she sensed the lifting, partially at least, of some appalling burden. "Yes, it's a weapon. A juggler killer." "Until today I'd have said no such thing was possible." "I doubt that it was very easy to synthesize. Countless biological entities have entered their oceans, and none of them have ever brought anything with them that the juggler couldn't assimilate in a harmless fashion. Doubtless some of those entities tried to inflict deliberate harm, if only out of morbid curiosity. None of them succeeded. Of course you can kill jugglers by brute force." He glanced toward the moat, where the mushroom cloud was dissipating. "But that isn't the point. Not subtle. But this is. It exploits a logical flaw in the juggler's own informational processing algorithms. It's insidious. And no, humans most certainly didn't invent it. We're clever, but we're not that clever." Nucky strove to keep him talking. "Who made it, Weir?" "The Ultras sold it to us in a pre-synthesized form. I've heard rumors that it was found inside the topmost chamber of a heavily fortified alien structure. Another that it was synthesized by a rival group of jugglers. Who knows? Who cares, even? It does what we ask of it. That's all that matters." "Please don't use it, Raphael." "I have to. It's what I came here to do." "But I thought you all loved the jugglers." His fingers caressed the glass globe. "It looks terribly fragile." "We?" "Crane, her delegates." "They do. But I'm not one of them." "Tell me what this is about, Raphael." It would be better if you just accepted what I have to do. Naki swallowed. If you kill them, you kill more than just an alien life form. You erase the memory of every sentient creature that's ever entered the ocean. Unfortunately, that rather happens to be the point. Weir dropped the glass into the sea. It hit the water, bobbed under, and then popped back out again, floating on the surface. The small globe was already immersed in a brackish scum of gray-green microorganisms. They were beginning to lap higher up the sides of the globe, exploring it. A couple of millimeters of ordinary glass would succumb to jugular erosion in perhaps 30 minutes. But Naki guessed that this was not ordinary glass, that it was designed to degrade much more rapidly. She jumped back down into her control seat and shot her boat forward. She came alongside Weir's boat, trapping the globe between the two craft. Taking desperate care not to nudge the hulls together, she stopped her boat and leaned over as far as she could without falling in. Her fingertips brushed the glass. Maddeningly, she could not quite get a grip on it. She made one last valiant effort, and it drifted beyond her reach. Now it was out of her range, no matter how hard she stretched. Weir watched impassively. Naki slipped into the water. The layer of jugular organisms licked her chin and nose, the smell immediate and overwhelming now that she was in such close proximity. Her fear was absolute. It was the first time she had entered the water since Mina's death. She caught the globe, taking hold of it with the exquisite care she might have reserved for a rare bird's egg. Already the glass had the porous texture of pumice. She held it up for Weir to see. "I won't let you do this, Raphael." "I admire your concern." "It's more than concern. My sister is here. She's in the ocean. And I won't let you take her away from me." Weir reached inside a pocket and removed another globe. They sped away from the node in Naki's boat. The new globe rested in his hand like a gift. He had not yet dropped it in the sea, although the possibility was only ever an instant away. They were far from any node now, but the globe would be guaranteed to come in contact with jugular matter sooner or later. Naki opened a watertight equipment locker, pushing aside the flare pistol and first aid kit that lay within. Carefully she placed the globe inside, and then watched in horror as the glass immediately cracked and dissolved, releasing its poison. Little black, irregularly shaped grains like burnt sugar. If the boat sank, the locker would eventually be consumed into the ocean, along with its fatal contents. She considered using the flare pistol to incinerate the remains, but there seemed too much danger of dispersing it at the same time. Perhaps the toxin had a restricted lifespan once it came into contact with air, but that was nothing she could count on. But Weir had not thrown the third globe into the sea, not yet. Something she had said had made him hesitate. "Your sister?" "You know the story," Naki said. "Mina was a conformal. The ocean assimilated her entirely rather than just recording her neural patterns. It took her as a prize." "And you believe that she's still present in some sentient sense?" "That's what I choose to believe, yes. And there's enough anecdotal evidence from other swimmers that conformals do persist in a more coherent form than other stored patterns." "I can't let anecdotal evidence sway me, Naki. Have the other swimmers specifically recorded encounters with Mina?" "No," Naki said carefully. She was sure that he would see through any lie that she attempted. "But they wouldn't necessarily recognize her if they did." "And you? Did you attempt to swim yourself?" "The swimmer corps would never have allowed me." "Not my question. Did you ever swim?" "Once," Naki said. "And?" "It didn't count. It was the same time that Mina died." She paused and then told him all that had happened. "We were seeing more sprite activity than we'd ever recorded. It seemed like coincidence." "I don't think it was." Naki said nothing. She waited for Weir to collect his own thoughts, concentrating on the steering of the boat. Open sea lay ahead, but she knew that almost any direction would bring them to a cluster of nodes within a few hours. "It began with the Pelican in impiety," Weir said. "A century ago. There was a man from Zion on that ship. During the stopover, he descended to the surface of Turquoise and swam in your ocean. He made contact with the jugglers and then swam again. The second time, the experience was even more affecting. On the third occasion, the sea swallowed him. He'd been a conformal, just like your sister. His name was Ormuzd." "It means nothing to me." "I assure you that on his home world it means a great deal more. Ormuzd was a failed tyrant, fleeing a political counter-revolution on Zion. He had murdered and cheated his way to power on Zion, burning his rivals in their houses while they slept. But there'd been a backlash. He got out just before the ring closed around him and a handful of his closest allies and devotees. They escaped aboard the Pelican in impiety." "And Ormuzd died here?" "Yes, but his followers didn't. They made it to Haven, our world, and once there they began to proliferate, spreading their word, recruiting new followers. It didn't matter that Ormuzd was gone. Quite the opposite. He'd martyred himself, given them a saint figure to worship. It evolved from a political movement into a religious cult. The Vahishta Foundation's just a front for the Ormuzd sect." Naki absorbed that, then asked, "Where does Amisha come into it?" "Amisha was his daughter. She wants her father back." Something lit the horizon, a pink-edged flash. Another followed a minute later, in nearly the same position. "She wants to commune with him?" "More than that," said Weir. "They all want to become him, to accept his neural patterns on their own. They want the jugglers to imprint Ormuzd's personality on all his followers, to remake them in his own image. The aliens will do that if the right gifts are offered, and that's what I can't allow." Naki chose her words carefully, sensing that the tiniest thing could push Weir into releasing the globe. She had prevented his last attempt, but he would not allow her a second chance. All he would have to do would be to crush the globe in his fist before spilling the contents into the ocean. Then it would all be over. Everything she had ever known, everything she had ever lived for. "But we're only talking about 19 people," she said. Weir laughed hollowly. "I'm afraid it's a little more than that. Why don't you turn on the radio and see what I mean?" Naki did as he suggested, using the boat's general communications console. The small, scuffed screen received television pictures beamed down from the ComSat network. Naki flicked through channels, finding static on most of them. The Snowflake Council's official news service was off the air, and no personal messages were getting through. There were some suggestions that the ComSat network itself was damaged. Yet finally, Naki found a few weak broadcast signals from the nearest snowflake cities. There was a sense of desperation in the transmissions, as if they expected to fall silent at any time. Weir nodded with weary acceptance, as if he had expected this. In the last 6 hours, at least a dozen more shuttles had come down from the Voice of Evening. They had been packed with armed Vahishta disciples. The shuttles had attacked the planet's major snowflake cities and atoll settlements, strafing them into submission. 3 cities had fallen into the sea, their vacuum bladders punctured by beam weapons. There could be no survivors. Others were still aloft but had been set on fire. The pictures showed citizens leaping from the city's birthing arms, falling like sparks. More cities had been taken bloodlessly and were now under control of the disciples. None of those cities were transmitting now. It was the end of the world. Naki knew that she should be weeping, or at the very least feel some writhing sense of loss in her stomach. But all she felt was a sense of denial, a refusal to accept that events could have escalated so quickly. This morning the only hint of wrongness had been a single absent disciple. "There are tens of thousands of them up there," Weir said. "All that you've seen so far is the advance guard." Naki scratched her forearm. It was itching as if she had caught a dose of sunburn. Moreau was in on this? Captain Moreau's a puppet. Literally. The body you saw was just being teleoperated by orbital disciples. They murdered the Ultras, commandeered the ship. Raphael, why didn't you tell us this before? My position was too vulnerable. I was the only anti-Ormuzd agent my movement managed to put aboard the Voice of Evening. If I'd attempted to warn the Turquoise authorities, well, work it out for yourself. Almost certainly I wouldn't have been believed, and the disciples would have found a way to silence me before I became an embarrassment, and it wouldn't have made a difference to their takeover plans. My only hope was to destroy the ocean, to remove its usefulness to them. They might still have destroyed your cities out of spite, but at least they'd have lost the final thread that connected them to their martyr. Weir leaned closer to her. Don't you understand? It wouldn't have stopped with the disciples aboard the Voice. They'd have brought more ships from Haven. Your ocean would have become a production line for despots. Why did they hesitate, if they had such a crushing advantage over us? They didn't know about me, so they lost nothing by dedicating a few weeks to intelligence gathering. They wanted to know as much as possible about Turquoise and the jugglers before they made their move. They're brutal, but they're not inefficient. They wanted their takeover to be as precise and surgical as possible. And now? They've accepted that things won't be quite that neat and tidy. He flipped the globe from one palm to another with a casual playfulness that Naki found alarming. They're serious, Naki. Crane will stop at nothing now. You've seen those blast flashes, pinpoint antimatter devices. They've already sterilized the organic matter within the moat to stop the effect of my weapon from reaching farther. If they know where we are, they'll drop a bomb on us as well. Human evil doesn't give us the excuse to wipe out the ocean. It's not an excuse, Naki. It's an imperative. At that moment, something glinted on the horizon, something that was moving slowly from east to west. The shuttle, Weir said. It's looking for us. Naki scratched her arm again. It was discolored, itching. Near local noon, they reached the next node. The shuttle had continued to dog them, nosing to and fro along the hazy band where sea met sky. Sometimes it appeared closer, sometimes it appeared farther away. But it did not leave them alone, and Naki knew that it would only be a matter of time before it detected a positive homing trace, a chemical or physical trace in the water that would lead to its quarry. The shuttle would cover the remaining distance in a matter of seconds, a minute at the most, and then all that she and Weir would know would be a moment of cleansing whiteness, a fire of holy purity. Even if Weir released his toxin just before the shuttle arrived, it would not have time to dissipate into a wide enough volume of water to survive the fireball. So why was he hesitating? It was Mina, of course. Naki's sister had given a name to the faceless library of stored minds he was prepared to erase. She had removed the one-sidedness of the moral equation, and now Weir had to accept that his own actions could never be entirely blameless. I should just do this, he said. By hesitating even for a second, I'm betraying the trust of the people who sent me here, people who have probably been tormented to extinction by Ormuzd's followers. Naki shook her head. If you didn't show doubt, you'd be as bad as the disciples. You almost sound as if you want me to do it. She groped for something resembling the truth, as painful as that might be. Perhaps I do. Even though it would mean killing whatever part of Mina survived? I've lived in her shadow my entire life. Even after she died, I always felt she was still watching me, still observing my every mistake, still being faintly disappointed when I wasn't living up to all she had imagined I could be. You're being harsh on yourself. Harsh on Mina, too, by the likes of things. I know, Naki said angrily. I'm just telling you how I feel. The boat edged into a curving inlet that pushed deep into the node. Naki felt less vulnerable now. There was a significant depth of organic matter to screen the boat from any sideways-looking sensors that the shuttle might have deployed, even though the evidence suggested that the shuttle's sensors were mainly focused down from its hull. The disadvantage was that it was no longer possible to keep a constant vigil on the shuttle's movements. It could be on its way already. She brought the boat to a halt and stood up from her control seat. "What's happening?" Weir asked. "I've come to a decision." "Isn't that my job?" Her anger, brief as it was and directed less at Weir than the hopelessness of the situation, had evaporated. "I mean about swimming. It's what we haven't considered yet, Raphael. That there might be a third way, a choice between accepting the disciples and letting the ocean die." "I don't see what that could be." "Nor do I. But the ocean might find a way. It just needs the knowledge of what's at stake." She stroked her forearm again, marveling at the sudden eruption of fungal patterns. They must have been latent for many years, but now something had caused them to flare up. Even in daylight, emeralds and blues shone against her skin. She suspected that the biochemical changes had been triggered when she entered the water to snatch the globe. Given that, she could not help but view it as a message. An invitation, perhaps. Or was it a warning, reminding her of the dangers of swimming? She had no idea. For her peace of mind, however, and given the lack of alternatives, she chose to view it as an invitation. But she did not dare wonder who was inviting her. "You think the ocean can understand external events?" Weir asked. "You said it yourself, Raphael. The night they told us the ship was coming. Somehow that information reached the sea, via a swimmer's memories, perhaps, and the jugglers knew then that this was something significant. Perhaps it was Ormuzd's personality rising to the fore. Or maybe it was merely the vast coral mind of the ocean, apprehending only that something was going to happen." "Either way," Naki said, "it still makes me think there might be a chance." "I only wish I shared your optimism." "Give me this chance, Raphael. That's all I ask." Naki removed her clothes, less concerned that Weir would see her naked now than that she should have something to wear when she emerged. But although Weir studied her with unconcealed fascination, there was nothing prurient about it. What commanded his attention, Naki realized, was the elaborate and florid patterning of the fungal markings. They curled and twined about her chest and abdomen and thighs, shining with a hypnotic intensity. "You're changing," he said. "We all change," Naki answered. Then she stepped from the side of the boat into the water. The process of descending into the ocean's embrace was much as she remembered it. She willed her body to submit to biochemical invasion, forcing down her fear and apprehension, knowing that she had been through this once before and that it was something that she could survive again. She did her best not to think about what it would mean to survive beyond this day, when all else had been shattered, every certainty crumbled. Mina came to her with merciful speed. "Naki?" "I'm here. Oh, Mina, I'm here." There was terror and there was joy, alloyed together. "It's been so long." Naki felt her sister's presence edge in and out of proximity and focus. Sometimes she appeared to share the same physical space. At other times she was scarcely more than a vague feeling of attentiveness. "How long?" 2 years, Mina." Mina's answer took an eternity to come. In that dreadful hiatus, Naki felt other minds crowd against her own, some of which were so far from human that she gasped at their oddity. Mina was only one of the conformal minds that had noticed her arrival, and not all were as benignly curious or glad. "It doesn't feel like 2 years to me." "How long?" "Days, hours. It changes." "What do you remember?" Mina's presence danced around Naki. "I remember what I remember. That we swam when we weren't meant to. That something happened to me and I never left the ocean." "You became part of it, Mina." The triumphalism of her answer shocked Naki to the marrow. Yes. You wanted this? You would want it if you knew what it was like. You could have stayed, Naki. You could have let it happen to you the way it happened to me. We were so alike. I was scared. Yes, I remember. Naki knew that she had to get to the heart of things. Time was passing differently here. Witness Mina's confusion about how long she had been part of the ocean, and there was no telling how patient Weir would be. He might not wait until Naki re-emerged before deploying the juggler killer. There was another mind, Mina. We encountered it, and it scared me. Enough that I had to leave the ocean. Enough that I never wanted to go back. You've come back now. It's because of that other mind. It belonged to a man called Ormuzd. Something very bad is going to happen because of him, one way or the other. There was a moment that transcended anything Naki had experienced before. She felt herself and Mina become inseparable. She could not say where one began and the other ended, but it was entirely pointless to even think in those terms. If only fleetingly, Mina had become her. Every thought, every memory, was open to equal scrutiny by both of them. Naki understood what it was like for Mina. Her sister's memories were rapturous. She might only have sensed the passing of hours or days, but that belied the richness of her experience since merging with the ocean. She had exchanged experience with countless alien minds, drinking in entire histories beyond normal human comprehension. And in that moment of sharing, Naki appreciated something of the reason for her sister having been taken in the first place. Conformals were the ocean's way of managing itself. Now and then, the maintenance of the vaster archive of static minds required stewardship, the drawing in of independent intelligences. Mina had been selected and utilized and given rewards beyond imagining for her efforts. The ocean had tapped the structure of her intelligence at a subconscious level. Only now and then had she ever felt that she was being directly petitioned on a matter of importance. But Ormuzd's mind... Mina had seen Naki's memories now. She would know exactly what was at stake, and she would know exactly what that mind represented. I was always aware of him. He wasn't always there. He liked to hide himself. But even when he was absent, he left a shadow of himself. I even think he might be the reason the ocean took me as a conformal. It sensed a coming crisis. It knew Ormuzd had something to do with it. It had made a terrible mistake by swallowing him. So it reached out for new allies, minds it could trust. Minds like Mina, Naki thought. In that instant she did not know whether to admire the pattern jugglers or detest them for their heartlessness. Ormuzd was contaminating it? His influence was strong. His force of personality was a kind of poison in its own right. The pattern jugglers knew that, I think. Why couldn't they just eject his patterns? They couldn't. It doesn't work that way. The sea is a storage medium, but it has no self-censoring facility. If the individual minds detect a malign presence, they can resist it. But Ormuzd's mind is human. There aren't enough of us here to make a difference, Naki. The other minds are too alien to recognize Ormuzd for what he is. They just see a sentience. Who made the pattern jugglers, Mina? Answer me that, will you? She sensed Mina's amusement. Even the jugglers don't know that, Naki. Or why? You have to help us, Mina. You have to communicate the urgency of this to the rest of the ocean. I'm one mind among many, Naki. One voice in the chorus. You still have to find a way. Please, Mina, understand this if nothing else. You could die. You all could die. I lost you once, but now I know you never really went away. I don't want to have to lose you again for good. You didn't lose me, Naki. I lost you. She hauled herself from the water. Weir was waiting where she had left him, with the intact globe still resting in his hand. The daylight shadows had moved a little, but not as much as she had feared. She made eye contact with Weir, wordlessly communicating a question. "The shuttle's come closer. It's flown over the node twice while you were under. I think I need to do this, Naki." He had the globe between thumb and forefinger, ready to drop it into the water. She was shivering. Naki pulled on her shorts and shirt, but she felt just as cold afterwards. The fungal marks were shimmering intensely, seeming to hover above her skin. If anything, they were shining more furiously than before she had swum. Naki did not doubt that if she had lingered, if she had stayed with Mina, she would have become a conformal as well. It had always been in her, but it was only now that her time had come. "Please wait," Naki said, her own voice sounding pathetic and childlike. "Please wait, Raphael." There it is again. The shuttle was a fleck of white sliding over the top of the nearest wall of jugular biomass. It was 5 or 6 kilometers away, much closer than the last time Naki had seen it. Now it came to a sudden sharp halt, hovering above the surface of the ocean, as if it had found something of particular interest. "Do you think it knows we're here?" "It suspects something," Weir said. The globe rolled between his fingers. "Look," Naki said. The shuttle was still hovering. Naki stood up to get a better view, nervous of making herself visible, but desperately curious. Something was happening. She knew something was happening. Kilometers away, the sea was bellying up beneath the shuttle. The water was the color of moss, supersaturated with microorganisms. Naki watched as a coil of solid green matter reached from the ocean, twisting and writhing. It was as thick as a building, spilling vast rivulets of water as it emerged. It extended upward with astonishing haste, bifurcating and flexing like a groping fist. For a brief moment it closed around the shuttle. Then it slithered back into the sea with a titanic splash, a prolonged roar of spent energy. The shuttle continued to hover above the same spot, as if oblivious to what had just happened. Yet the manta-shaped craft's white hull was lathered with various hues of green. And Naki understood. What had happened to the shuttle was what had happened to Arviat, the city that drowned. She could not begin to guess the crime that Arviat had committed against the sea, the crime that had merited its destruction, but she could believe now, at least, that the jugglers had been capable of dragging it beneath the waves, ripping the main mass of the city away from the bladders that held it aloft. And of course such a thing would have to be kept maximally secret, known only to a handful of individuals. Otherwise no city would ever feel safe when the sea roiled and groaned beneath it. But a city was not a shuttle. Even if the jugular material started eating away the fabric of the shuttle, it would still take hours to do any serious damage, and that was assuming the Ultras had no better protection than the ceramic shielding used on Turquoise boats and machines. But the shuttle was already tilting over. Naki watched it pitch, attempt to regain stability, and then pitch again. She understood belatedly. The organic matter was clogging the shuttle's whisking propulsion systems, limiting its ability to hover. The shuttle was curving inexorably closer to the sea, spiraling steeply away from the node. It approached the surface, and then just before the moment of impact, another misshapen fist of organized matter thrust from the sea, seizing the hull in its entirety. That was the last Naki saw of it. A troubled calm fell on the scene. The sky overhead was unmarred by questing machinery. Only the thin whisper of smoke rising from the horizon in the direction of the moat hinted of the day's events. Minutes passed, and then tens of minutes. Then a rapid series of bright flashes strobed from beneath the surface of the sea itself. "That was the shuttle," Weir said, wonderingly. Naki nodded. "The jugglers are fighting back. This is more or less what I hoped would happen." "You asked for this?" "I think Mina understood what was needed. Evidently she managed to convince the rest of the ocean, or at least this part of it." "Let's see." They searched the airwaves again. The ComSat network was dead or silent. Even fewer cities were transmitting now. But those that had not been overrun by Ormuzd's disciples, told a frightening story. The ocean was clawing at them, trying to drag them into the sea. Weather patterns were shifting, entire storms being conjured into existence by the orchestrated circulation of vast ocean currents. It was happening in concentric waves, racing away from the precise point in the ocean where Naki had swum. Some cities had already fallen into the sea, though it was not clear whether this had been brought about by the jugglers themselves or because of damage to their vacuum bladders. There were people in the water, hundreds, thousands of them. They were swimming, trying to stay afloat, trying not to drown. But what exactly did it mean to drown on Turquoise? "It's happening all over the planet," Naki said. She was still shivering, but now it was as much a shiver of awe as one of cold. "It's denying itself to us by smashing our cities." "Your cities never harmed it." "I don't think it's really that interested in making a distinction between one bunch of people and another, Raphael. It's just getting rid of us all, disciples or not. You can't really blame it for that, can you?" "I'm sorry," Weir said. He cracked the globe, spilled its contents into the sea. Naki knew there was nothing she could do now. There was no prospect of recovering the tiny black grains. She would only have to miss one, and it would be as bad as missing them all. The little black grains vanished beneath the olive surface of the water. It was done. Weir looked at her, his eyes desperate for forgiveness. "You understand that I had to do this, don't you? It isn't something I do lightly." "I know. But it wasn't necessary. The ocean's already turned against us. Crane has lost. Ormuzd has lost." "Perhaps you're right," Weir said. "But I couldn't take the chance that we might be wrong. At least this way I know for sure." "You've murdered a world." He nodded. "It's exactly what I came here to do. Please don't blame me for it." Naki opened the equipment locker where she had stowed the broken vial of juggler toxin. She removed the flare pistol, snatched away its safety pin, and pointed it at Weir. "I don't blame you, no. Don't even hate you for it." He started to say something, but Naki cut him off. "But it's not something I can forgive." She sat in silence, alone, until the node became active. The organic structures around her were beginning to show the same kinds of frantic rearrangement Naki had seen within the moat. There was a cold, sharp breeze from the node's heart. It was time to leave. She steered the boat away from the node, cautiously, still not completely convinced that she was safe from the delegates, even though the first shuttle had been destroyed. Undoubtedly, the loss of that craft would have been communicated to the others, and before very long some of them would arrive, bristling with belligerence. The ocean might attempt to destroy the new arrivals, but this time the delegates would be profoundly suspicious. She brought the boat to a halt when she was a kilometer from the fringe of the node. By then it was running through the same crazed alterations she had previously witnessed. She felt the same howling wind of change. In a moment the end would come. The toxin would seep into the node's controlling core, instructing the entire biomass to degrade itself to a lump of dumb vegetable matter. The same killing instructions would already be traveling along the internode tendril connections, winging their way over the horizon. Allowing for the topology of the network, it would only take 15 or 20 hours for the message to reach every node on the planet. Within a day it would be over. The jugglers would be gone, the information they'd encoded erased beyond recall. And Turquoise itself would begin to die at the same time, its oxygen atmosphere no longer maintained by the oceanic organisms. Another 5 minutes passed, then 10. The node's transformations were growing less hectic. She recalled this moment of false calm. It meant only that the node had given up trying to counteract the toxin, accepting the logical inevitability of its fate. 1,000 times over, this would be repeated around Turquoise. Toward the end, she guessed there would be less resistance, for the sheer futility of it would have been obvious. The world would accept its fate. Another 5 minutes passed. The node remained. The structures were changing, but only gently. There was no sign of the emerging mound of undifferentiated matter she had seen before. What was happening? She waited another quarter of an hour and then steered the boat back toward the node, bumping past Weir's floating corpse on the way. Tentatively, an idea was forming in her mind. It appeared that the node had absorbed the toxin without dying. Was it possible that Weir had made a mistake? Was it possible that the toxin's effectiveness depended only on it being used once? Perhaps. There still had to be tendril connections between the moat and the rest of the ocean at the time that the first wave of transformations had taken place. They had been severed later, either when the doors closed or by some autonomic process within the extended organism itself. But until that moment, there would still have been informational links with the wider network of nodes. Could the dying nodes have sent sufficient warning that the other nodes were now able to find a strategy for protecting themselves? Again, perhaps. It never paid to take anything for granted where the jugglers were concerned. She parked the boat by the node's periphery. Naki stood up and removed her clothes for the final time, certain that she would not need them again. She looked down at herself, astonished at the vivid tracery of green that now covered her body. On one level, the evidence of alien cellular invasion was quite horrific. On another, it was startlingly beautiful. Smoke licked from the horizon. Machines clawed through the sky, hunting nervously. She stepped to the edge of the boat, tensing herself at the moment of commitment. Her fear subsided, replaced by an intense, loving calm. She stood on the threshold of something alien, but in place of terror, what she felt was only an imminent sense of homecoming. Mina was waiting for her below. Together, nothing could stop them. Naki smiled, spread her arms, and returned to the sea.